Rain hammered the windshield, sharp enough that I felt it rattling through the bones of the car. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching the wipers struggle against the sheets of gray water that blurred the road ahead. The GPS insisted I was on track, but all I could see was darkness stretching into nothing, punctuated by the occasional flash of lightning that revealed twisted trees lining the wet asphalt. I didn't remember agreeing to come this far, but something, I still don't know what, had pulled me here. The hotel appeared without warning, a dim rectangle of light bleeding into the storm. Its shape was oddly familiar, like an image I might have seen in a magazine decades ago, but in reality it was smaller, older, and somehow lonelier. The sign above the entrance flickered, half of its letters dead. The H Hotel. The O in hotel buzzed faintly, a high-pitched hum that made my teeth ache. I slowed, nodding the gravel crunching under the tires. The storm didn't stop at the edges of the property. It seemed to hesitate, like it knew this place was different. When I stepped out, the wind slammed into me first, the rain slicing across my jacket. The air smelled of wet wood and something else I couldn't name. Decay, maybe. Or maybe it was just the weight of the building itself, pressing against the night. The doors to the hotel were heavy, and they groaned when I pushed them open. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its crystals dusty and dulled by years of neglect. The carpet had long lost its color, a faded red that barely hinted at what it had once been. The silence hit me before I even realized I was holding my breath. No desk clerk, no footsteps, no hum of electricity or heat. Just the storm outside, muffled by the walls and the soft drip of water somewhere behind the lobby, far enough away that it was impossible to place. I told myself someone had to be here, that hotels like this don't run themselves. Yet I couldn't see anyone. I walked forward. Each step echoed too loudly, bouncing off the high ceiling, the sound of my own presence amplified in the emptiness. I noticed the guest books on the counter. Yellowed pages, some torn, some written in hands that were messy, hurried, elegant. The entries were mostly names and dates, but every few pages I noticed a gap, a name written, then nothing. Sometimes months, sometimes years of empty pages. It made me shiver, the way absence can sometimes feel heavier than presence. As I wandered toward the staircase leading to the rooms, I felt it, a subtle vibration under the floorboards, like the building itself was exhaling. The railings were chipped, paint peeling in long curls. The walls were lined with portraits, though the faces were all blurred, either worn away by age or deliberately distorted. Their eyes seemed to follow me. I stopped in front of one painting. The man's gaze wasn't angry or sad, it was expectant, waiting. For what I didn't know. I felt heat rise in my chest and forced myself to look away. The storm continued to pound outside, but here inside the rain sounded muted, almost polite. I could hear the faint creak of hinges from the far hallway. I told myself it was the wind, that old buildings make noises when the weather changes. But then somewhere above me, a soft thud like a suitcase dropped or a door slammed lightly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent, but it was deliberate. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, looking down the corridor. The hallway stretched far beyond the reach of the chandelier's light. The doors were all closed, each with its brass number dulled by years. Room 7 caught my eye, slightly ajar, the shadows inside darker than the ones in the hallway. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it. Part of me wanted to retreat, to turn and leave while I still could. But another part, the part that had led me here through the rain, through roads I didn't know, pushed me forward. I stepped inside room 7. The door creaked, a long, slow sound that seemed to echo not just in the room, but somewhere far below, somewhere inside the building itself. The air was cold, and it carried the scent of damp fabric, old wood, and faintly, almost imperceptibly, something metallic like iron. The bed was made, but the sheets were stiff, as though they hadn't been slept in for months. A chair sat facing the corner, angled oddly, as if someone had been sitting there and had left in a hurry. I walked to the window. The glass was streaked with rain, the view mostly darkness and storm. But through the intermittent flashes of lightning, I thought I saw something. Another window on a floor above with a shadow that moved. Or maybe it didn't move. Maybe I was imagining it, the storm fooling me. I pressed my hand to the cold glass, and the reflection staring back at me wasn't entirely mine. My hair was wet from the rain, my eyes wide, and yet there was something else, a faint outline behind me, just for a moment gone before I could confirm it. A notebook lay on the small desk. I opened it. The pages were filled with lists, names, dates, notes about guests who had checked in but never checked out. Some entries were recent, scrawled in haste. Others were decades old. There were scribbles in the margins, odd symbols I didn't recognize, circles and lines connecting names in strange patterns. I felt the room tilt slightly, as though the weight of all these missing people pressed down. My pulse sped. Then the lights flickered, just a second, barely enough for my brain to register it. And when the chandelier dimmed again, I noticed a shadow under the door moving against the grain of the floor. It stopped, waited. I swallowed, trying to calm my shaking hands. The sound of the storm outside felt distant now, replaced by the quiet drip from somewhere in the corner. Drip, drip, drip. I moved to leave, thinking maybe I needed to wake the night clerk to explain my arrival, but when I reached the door, I froze. There was a soft whisper, almost lost in the hum of the storm. "Don't go," my heart thudded. I spun around. The room was empty. Only the chair remained in the corner, its angle unchanged. The notebook still lay open, as though inviting me to read more. I told myself I was tired, that the storm and the drive had frayed my nerves. But there was something in the walls, in the very air of the hotel, that felt alive. Not alive like a person, alive like memory. Like the building remembered every guest, every loss, every moment that had ended here. And it remembered me now. I sat on the bed, staring at the notebook. Names blurred together, some familiar, some completely alien. Some seemed to repeat, appearing across years as if the same person had returned again and again, unnoticed. I realized then that the hotel wasn't just neglected, it was patient. It waited for people to arrive, watched them, kept track of them, and perhaps kept some of them forever. Thunder shook the building, the sound deep and rolling, and the chandelier rattled above me. My eyes darted around the room. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet I felt it, a presence just beyond vision, attentive, waiting. I wasn't sure if it was friendly or cruel, or if it even cared at all. But I knew one thing. The night was far from over, and the hotel had only just begun to reveal itself. I could leave. I could step back into the rain, drive away, and pretend this was just a forgotten building on a stormy night. But a small, insistent part of me, curiosity or stubbornness or foolishness, urged me to stay, to see what else the hotel might show, what secrets lay hidden in its silent floors and shadowed hallways. And as I reached for the notebook again, the whisper returned. Softer this time, almost tender. "You'll want to see this." I sat back and waited. The storm raged, the lights flickered, and the hotel exhaled around me. I felt like I had stepped into another world, one that existed between the seconds of the storm, between the drip of water, between the names in the notebook. And I knew somehow that the longer I stayed, the more I would see, the more I would understand, and perhaps the more I would never leave. Outside, the rain continued its assault. Inside, the building waited, and I realized I had arrived at the edge, not just of the road or of the storm, but of something else entirely. Something patient, something alive, something that remembered. The door clicked behind me, and for a moment the sound swallowed me entirely. The room was darker than I expected, the single lamp on the nightstand struggling to push back shadows that pooled in the corners. I felt the air shift the instant I stepped inside, cooler, heavier, carrying a weight that made my skin prickle. I shivered, tugging my jacket tighter around me, and tried to convince myself it was just the storm outside, that the building itself wasn't trying to breathe around me. The bedspread was stiff, the fabric coarse against my fingers as I ran them over the sheets. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, a scent so sharp it made my stomach twist. I set my bag on the floor, hearing the zipper click open, but when I reached to take out the notebook I'd brought, it wasn't there. My hand brushed the empty space where I was certain it had been. My pulse jumped. I scanned the room, half expecting it to have fallen behind the bed. Nothing. A soft tapping echoed from the window. Rain, I thought. But when I approached, the glass was dry inside and the tap, tap, tap continued. I froze, my hand hovering above the sill. For a moment I thought I heard a breath, shallow, just behind me. I spun, but the room was empty. The chair in the corner sat exactly where I'd left it, angled toward the wall, as though some unseen presence preferred to watch without being seen. The temperature dropped suddenly. My breath rose in faint clouds, and I realized the cold was localized, like someone had opened an invisible door somewhere in the room. I moved toward it instinctively, feeling my fingertips tingle. There was a shadow on the wall, long and thin, stretching and retracting, though nothing in the room could have cast it. It didn't belong to me. I stepped closer, and it seemed to recoil slightly, then stretch again, teasing the edge of my vision. I sank onto the bed, heart hammering, and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Old hotels creak. Shadows play tricks. Storms make things seem alive. But when I glanced at my bag again, I saw my notebook, resting on the desk exactly where I'd first intended to place it. My hands had never moved it. My stomach dropped. I didn't dare touch it yet. Instead, I studied the room, trying to convince myself that the air wasn't whispering with the faint sound of murmurs I couldn't place. The desk lamp flickered once, then steadied. I noticed something I hadn't before, a small photograph lying face down on the nightstand. I reached for it. The paper was brittle, edges curled with age. I turned it over slowly. A man, or maybe a boy, sat on the bed, staring directly at the camera. His expression was blank, but his eyes, they felt alive. They followed me, even as I moved the photograph slightly, even as I set it down again. I caught my reflection in the lamp's polished base, and for a second I thought I saw another figure standing behind me, blurred, almost insubstantial. Gone when I blinked. I tried to distract myself by unpacking my things, placing the notebook carefully on the desk, a pen beside it. But as I reached for the pen, it slipped from my fingers, bouncing softly on the floor, only to vanish before it hit the carpet. I leaned down, searching, and the pen lay perfectly upright on the bedspread. I hadn't moved it. My hands shook. I picked it up cautiously, setting it firmly on the desk. The clock on the wall ticked, but the second hand seemed to stutter, pausing briefly before moving again. I shook my head. It was a mechanical fault, nothing more. Yet the sound of it tick, tick, tick felt exaggerated, each second stretching impossibly long. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to block the sensation, but when I looked up again, the shadows in the corners had shifted. Not subtly. They had leaned closer to the walls, like they were pressing against something invisible, listening. I walked toward the closet, hoping for a rational explanation. The doors were closed, and when I opened them, I expected empty hangers. Instead, a faint outline of a person pressed against the far wall inside, only visible in the darkness, a hollow shape with no details. I blinked and it was gone. I closed the closet slowly, my hands lingering on the edge of the door. Something small brushed my arm, soft, fleeting like a whisper of fabric, but nothing was there. I sat back on the bed, trying to calm my racing mind. The room seemed to breathe around me, expanding and contracting in ways I couldn't track. I could feel it watching me, not maliciously but patiently, as though it had been waiting for anyone to notice its presence. A calendar lay on the desk, the pages from years ago still intact, but as I flipped through them, the dates didn't line up with reality. There were scribbles in margins, numbers crossed out, some names written faintly in pencil, erased, then rewritten. My curiosity surged despite my fear. What was this place keeping track of? A low hum filled the room. Not outside, not mechanical, but inside the walls, inside the air itself. My ears strained to identify it. Then I realized the sound had a rhythm, like a heartbeat, or maybe someone was knocking very softly from within the walls themselves. The idea made my skin crawl. I wanted to leave, wanted to run, but something compelled me to stay, to understand why the room felt alive. The window rattled gently, and I noticed the storm outside had intensified. Yet the rain seemed distant now, muted, almost polite. I glanced at the floor. My bag, which had been placed carefully in one corner, had shifted a few inches. I hadn't moved. My stomach turned. Each object I touched seemed to have its own will, A small, insistent way of reminding me I wasn't fully in control here. I picked up the photograph again. This time the figure on it looked slightly different. The mouth was curved, not in a smile, but in something closer to a smirk. The eyes, those impossibly alive eyes, seemed to regard me with recognition, as though it remembered my arrival. I set it down, trying to laugh quietly at myself, but the laugh died in my throat. I wasn't sure if I had heard a whisper say my name, or if it had been the room projecting it, bending my own thoughts back at me. The bedspread shivered as if something moved beneath it. I froze, heart hammering, watching for any sign, any explanation. Nothing appeared. But when I reached to smooth the sheets, I felt a small weight, like a hand had rested there for a moment, leaving its imprint in the fabric. I pulled back quickly, the sense of presence thickening, almost tangible. I wanted to leave, to lock the door and run back to the lobby, but the curiosity, the magnetic pull of this room, kept me rooted. Minutes or maybe hours passed. Time felt fractured. I noticed the lamp flicker again, casting long, exaggerated shadows that moved independently of the furniture. I followed one with my eyes. It bent around the corner, stretched toward the bed, recoiled, and disappeared. I realized I wasn't simply observing the room. I was participating in it, a visitor in a place that demanded attention, demanded recognition. The notebook called to me. I opened it, and the pages revealed scrawled entries I hadn't made, notes about guests who had stayed in this room before me. Small, mundane things at first. Left keys on desk, slept poorly, room cold at night. But the later entries were stranger. Something watches from the corner, pen moved on its own. I felt remembered. I flipped through, heart pounding. The last entry was my handwriting from this very evening, a note I hadn't written yet. A draft brushed across the room, though the window was shut tight. Papers shifted, the lamp flickered. I sat back, trying to catch my breath. I realized something about this place. It kept memories, stored them in the air, in the furniture, in the shadows. It wasn't just a room, it was a record, a witness, and I was now part of it. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling. The shadows seemed to lean closer, patient and expectant. The air was colder now, more insistent. I wasn't afraid, at least not entirely. Fear had transformed into something else, awareness. A cautious understanding that the room was alive in ways I couldn't yet define, and that leaving or staying was no longer entirely my choice. I lay back on the bed, careful not to touch anything else. The storm outside had become a whisper. The room's heartbeat, or was it mine, filled the silence. Objects shifted subtly, shadows bent impossibly, and the notebook waited on the desk. The photograph stared from the nightstand, eyes bright, unreadable. The pen rested quietly beside it, for now. And I knew I wasn't alone. Not in the way I had expected, but in the way that made every second a negotiation. I closed my eyes, letting the room claim my attention, willing myself to observe without panic. Because something here wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to exist in my awareness. I didn't know if I would sleep. I didn't know if I could leave. But I knew, without question, that room 7 was waiting for me, and I was waiting right back. The corridor was darker than the room, the lamp at the end of the hall barely pushing back shadows that pooled in corners and stretched along the faded wallpaper. I stepped out of room 7, my shoes quiet on the thin carpet. Yet each footfall felt amplified, hollow, as if the hotel itself were listening. I didn't know why I felt compelled to wander, but something, a curiosity or an invisible tug, pulled me forward. A mirror hung on the wall, tall and narrow, its frame chipped and faded. I didn't want to look, yet I found myself drawn to it. My reflection stared back, pale in the dim light, hair damp, eyes wide, heart thrumming. And then in the corner of the glass I saw movement, not my own. A shadow slipped across the reflection, fluid, almost human, but gone the instant I blinked. I turned. The corridor was empty. The silence pressed against me like a living thing. I continued down the hall, each door closed, each number tarnished. Room 12, 14, 16 each seemed untouched, yet somehow heavy with expectation. The air grew colder with every step, carrying a faint metallic scent like blood or rust. I shivered, tugging my jacket tighter, aware of the way shadows seemed to shift just beyond vision. I told myself it was the storm outside, that old buildings bend the mind, that mirrors play tricks. But I felt watched, patient, and quiet. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed a door slightly ajar. The brass plate read "Maintenance." I hadn't seen it on the floor plan. The dark interior seemed to breathe, sucking in the light from the hall. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob. A faint scratching echoed from within, soft, almost rhythmic, like claws against wood. I stepped back. The sound stopped. I pressed closer. It resumed, then ceased again, teasing me. I left the door and continued to the stairwell. The steps groaned under my weight, each one a long, mournful sound. At the landing, a small ledger lay on a narrow table. Dust coated its leather cover, thick and undisturbed. I knelt, brushing it off, feeling the grit crumble under my fingers. The first page bore names, dates, check-in times, check-out times. Nothing remarkable. But then I noticed gaps. Blank spaces where a guest had arrived, yet no record of departure. Some entries were decades old. Others were recent. Names I recognized, though I shouldn't have. I flipped through the ledger, my fingers trembling. A faint breeze brushed my neck, though the corridor was still. Some pages were annotated with notes in the margins. Never left, found the next morning, disappeared in room 7. My pulse quickened. Room 7, my room. I slammed the ledger closed, but a page slipped free, landing face up. A single name, mine, written in faint pencil, as if the hotel had known I would arrive before I did. A soft creak drew my eyes to the stairwell. The steps were empty, yet I felt someone or something descend above me. I froze, heart hammering. The air shifted, heavier now, almost palpable. I wanted to call out, wanted to laugh at myself, to say this was absurd. But the corridor seemed to tighten around me, pressing close, containing me. I returned to the mirror, compelled, unable to resist. My reflection greeted me, pale and taut with tension. And then again, movement, not mine. Figures flashed across the glass. A man hunched over a suitcase, a woman with hollow eyes staring from a doorway, a child peeking around a corner. Each figure disappeared before I could focus, leaving only the faintest afterimage, a memory the mirror had trapped. I reached toward the glass. My fingers hovered over the reflection, but the figures recoiled, vanishing into the depths of the hallway behind the glass. I walked further, keeping my gaze fixed on the mirror. The reflections began to multiply, overlapping, folding into one another. Some faces were familiar or seemed familiar, twisted by time and shadow. I felt an inexplicable sorrow for them, a sense of loss and waiting that settled heavy on my chest. Were they guests who had stayed here too long? Did the hotel claim them, store them in the reflection, in the corners of the hall where light didn't reach? A soft knocking came from somewhere, perhaps behind the mirror, perhaps further down the hall. I didn't move. My fingers grazed the surface, cold and hard. The reflection rippled slightly, like water disturbed by wind. And then, impossibly, the figures in the mirror began to speak. Whispered names, phrases I couldn't fully catch. "Don't leave, stay, remember." My skin prickled. I backed away. The corridor was still again, but the echo lingered, a pressure in my chest I couldn't ignore. I glanced at the doors. Each was a portal to the unknown, yet room 7 called louder than the others. A low, almost imperceptible vibration hummed through the floorboards, rhythmic, persistent. I moved toward it, drawn despite every warning. The hallway stretched, longer than it should have, corridors bending subtly, impossible angles. My mind rebelled against the geometry. Something about this place distorted reality just enough to make me doubt my own senses. Room 7 appeared just as I had left it, yet somehow different. The door seemed darker, heavier, as though the shadows had thickened inside. I hesitated, listening. Nothing. No whispers, no shifting objects. But the notebook on the desk glimmered faintly, edges catching the dim light. I approached cautiously, heart hammering in my throat. The room felt alive, aware of my attention, holding its breath. I picked up the notebook. The pages were no longer blank where I had paused. New entries had appeared, describing my own movements in the room, my thoughts, even my hesitation in the hallway. My handwriting, or something nearly identical, recorded every detail. I staggered back, disbelief mingling with fascination. The hotel was observing me, recording me, waiting to see what I would do next. A sudden shift in temperature made me shiver violently. The air grew damp like breath on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, expecting the shadows to move closer. They didn't, but the mirror at the end of the hall, visible through the open door, reflected me differently. My face looked drawn, older, haunted. My eyes carried a weight that wasn't entirely mine. A sense of time compressed, folded. Had I been here longer than I realized? Or was the reflection showing something I hadn't lived yet? The door creaked behind me. I whirled. Nothing. The chair remained angled toward the corner, empty. But I could feel it, the presence of someone or something shifting in the periphery. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse, breathing with a rhythm slightly out of sync with mine. I realized with a sinking sensation that the hotel wasn't just keeping records. It was active, alive in a way that transcended walls and furniture, and I was now part of its catalog. I sank onto the bed, notebook in lap, eyes darting to the mirror at the end of the corridor. Reflections moved independently, echoing the ledger, showing glimpses of others who had passed through these halls. Some vanished in haste, some lingered in corners, eyes wide with unspoken knowledge. I wanted to flee, but my curiosity rooted me. I wanted to see what room 7 and the hotel would reveal next. A faint whisper drifted from the hallway. "Look deeper," it said, barely audible, almost coaxing. I leaned closer to the notebook. Names, dates, and scribbles filled the pages in a pattern I couldn't decipher. Some entries referenced rooms I hadn't noticed, floors that didn't exist. And then, inexplicably, a single word appeared at the bottom of the page. You. The air thickened. Shadows leaned closer. My reflection in the mirror seemed to breathe independently, rising on the balls of its feet for just an instant before returning to stillness. I realized I was no longer alone in the hotel's observation. The corridor, the room, the mirror, they were waiting, and I was the newest participant. I placed the notebook carefully on the desk and stood. The hall beyond the door seemed to stretch further, darker than before. Every instinct told me to leave, to step into the storm outside and never return. But a quiet, insistent part of me, the part that had driven me this far, urged me forward. To explore, to witness, to understand. To see what else the hotel wanted to show me before dawn. I glanced one last time at the mirror. Shadows flickered, figures paused, and my reflection smiled faintly, not mine, but mine. Then the hallway swallowed them again. I stepped into the corridor, feeling the cold press around me, and understood that this night was far from over. That the hotel and room 7 were not finished with me. That there were stories in the shadows I had yet to read, and reflections I had yet to meet. The ledger, the mirror, the shadows, they waited, and so did I. The hallway beyond room 7 was quiet now, too quiet, and the silence pressed against me like water against glass. I could still feel the weight of the mirror, the lingering presence of the ledger, the shadows that had flinched and recoiled when I dared to look. I thought I understood the hotel a little better, but that understanding only made the emptiness heavier. It was patient, and I was beginning to realize that patience wasn't benign. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook, trying to steady my breathing. The storm outside had softened to a distant murmur, wind rustling through broken eaves, rain sliding down the roof in endless, uneven sheets. But the room itself didn't move. Not a draft, not a sound from the walls. And yet I could feel something shifting just beyond my perception. Something deliberate enough to make my muscles tighten reflexively. Then came the footsteps. Slow, soft, deliberate from the corridor outside my door. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears louder than the storm, echoing through the small space. Each step was measured, patient, as though someone or something was packing, circling, waiting. I strained to listen, willing the sound to continue to tell me what was happening. But after several steps, it stopped. I held my breath, my ears aching. Nothing came. No pause, no return, just silence that weighed on me. I approached the door cautiously. The doorknob was cold, almost icy to the touch, and I realized that the temperature in the room had dropped again, focused in this small space. The air shimmered subtly, like heat rising from asphalt, though there was no warmth, only an oppressive chill. I placed my ear against the door. Silence. The footsteps had vanished. I wanted to laugh at myself, to convince myself it was my imagination, nerves frayed by the storm and the hotel's strange energy. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew better. I returned to the bed, heart still hammering, and opened the notebook again. Pages I had read earlier had changed. Notes appeared where none had existed. Scribbles in the margins, faint pencil marks that seemed to track my movements in the room. Sat here, looked there, noticed the footsteps. I closed it quickly, my hand trembling. Someone or something was recording me now, even more intimately than before. I was no longer merely a guest. I was part of the ledger's history, a new name in its unending catalog. A whisper drifted through the room, soft, almost hesitant. "Don't leave." I couldn't tell if it came from the walls, the air itself, or my own mind. I pressed my palms to my ears, willing it away, but the sound persisted, curling around my skull, curling into my chest. The shadows in the corners seemed to thicken in response, pulsing faintly, like the slow inhalation of something waiting to exhale. I glanced around. The chair in the corner hadn't moved. The bedspread remained stiff. And yet I felt eyes on me, and I knew I was being observed. Not in the way a person observes another. This was different. This was awareness without form, attention without flesh, intelligence without body. The room had learned my habits, memorized my patterns, anticipated my reactions. I wasn't alone. Not really, not ever if I stayed here. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Faint, tentative, approaching the door from the corridor. I couldn't tell if they were above me, below me, or level with my own heartbeat. My pulse surged in response, each beat a drum I could not ignore. I wanted to call out, to demand explanation, but no words came. My throat felt constricted, as though the air had thickened into something solid. I reached for the notebook instinctively, flipping through the pages. The entries had changed once more. Names of previous guests, scribbled dates, their last recorded thoughts before vanishing. Some notes were simple: stayed too long, room 7 never forgets. Others were more disturbing. The mirror watches, footsteps outside never arrive. We are recorded and held here. I paused, staring at the last line. You will hear them tonight. The footsteps moved again. Soft, deliberate, measured, stopping short of my door. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Then a faint creak, almost imperceptible, as if someone had shifted their weight and vanished instantly. My stomach turned. I realized I could trace the path of the sound, but the path always ended just short, just beyond my reach. The hotel toyed with me, and I felt it clearly for the first time. It was alive, aware, patient. I sank to the floor, back against the bed, notebook clutched in my hands. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered, moved slightly as though breathing. The lamp above the nightstand buzzed faintly, not out of electrical failure, but in resonance with the room's attention. The air carried whispers, faint words I couldn't decipher, but each syllable was loaded with intent. A photograph on the desk caught my eye. I hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps I hadn't seen it clearly. A man seated in a chair, staring straight at the camera. His expression was neutral, yet his eyes seemed to gleam with knowledge. I realized slowly, with a chilling weight pressing on my chest, that this was not a guest photograph. This was a warning, a record of someone who had stayed too long, someone who had been claimed, or at least observed, and left as a memory for the hotel to keep. The lamp flickered again, and the shadows shifted violently for a brief instant. I froze. The notebook thumped softly against the floor as if nudged by a presence unseen. My pulse raced, and I realized the sound wasn't random. It was communicating, measuring, waiting. I wanted to leave, to flee into the storm, but my feet felt rooted, heavy as lead, chained to the floor by some unseen force. I pressed my back further into the bed, pulling the blanket around me like a shield. The whispers grew clearer, phrases threading through the room, forming words I could understand. Stayed, listened, watched, forgot, I shivered. Each word was a tether, linking me to every guest before me, every name in the ledger, every reflection in the mirrors. I was part of the history now, a new story in a long chain of disappearances and lingering presence. The footsteps came again, closer this time, deliberate, patient. I held my breath, the sound stopping just beyond the door, tantalizingly close, yet never entering. I realized then that the hotel didn't just record people. It toyed with perception, stretched time, bent reality. My mind spun with the realization. Hours or minutes passed, I couldn't tell. The storm outside had faded into a murmur, but the hotel's awareness filled the silence. I glanced at the notebook one final time. The latest entry was simple. He waits, she waits, you wait. I swallowed hard. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, and I felt the corners of the walls closing slightly, or perhaps that was my imagination. I reached for the door, fingers trembling. The handle was ice cold, unyielding, as though resisting my touch. I stepped back, heart hammering, and sat on the bed once more. Then a whisper, soft, fleeting, and unmistakable, drifted through the room. I never left. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't outside the door. It wasn't a recording. It came from somewhere inside the room, inside the air itself, curling into my ears and settling into my chest. I wanted to respond, to ask who, to demand explanation, but no sound emerged. My lips refused speech. My mind spun. The shadows flickered once more, as though acknowledging the whisper. The notebook lay open, the last words still there, waiting for me. I stared at them, feeling the weight of every guest who had ever stayed here pressing down, patient and unrelenting. The footsteps outside the door remained, invisible yet palpable, never arriving, never leaving. The hotel waited, and I waited with it, caught in the long stretch of silence that could last hours or years. I closed my eyes, breathing shallowly, aware of the cold, aware of the whispers, aware of the footsteps that never reached me. The hotel had become more than walls and floors. It was memory, attention, and patience, and it had claimed a place for me among its echoes. Outside, the storm continued its soft murmur. Inside, the shadows shifted, the notebook waited, and the whisper lingered. I never left. I knew deep down that some things in this hotel never left, and some, like me, would never truly depart. I first heard about room 13 on my second night behind the desk. The hotel was quiet then, a thick silence pressing against the walls like damp cloth. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside everything felt frozen, as though the building had its own heartbeat, slow and measured. I was straightening the papers on the counter when the night clerk, a thin man with pale eyes and a voice that seemed to scrape the air, leaned toward me. "You ever hear about room 13?" he asked, not really waiting for an answer. His fingers drummed lightly on the wood of the counter, the motion too casual, too deliberate. I shook my head, trying to sound casual. "No, I don't think we even have a room 13 on the floor plan." He chuckled softly, low and dry, like wind rustling through dead leaves. "We do, or we did. Some things don't get erased, even when you want them to." I leaned on the counter, curiosity nudging me forward. There was a tension in his voice, almost reverence. "What do you mean?" He glanced around briefly, as if the walls themselves had ears. "Locked for decades," he whispered. "Key hasn't turned in that lock in 50 years, maybe more. Not a guest has slept there in living memory. But some nights, you hear it calling." I frowned. "Calling?" "A door doesn't call like a person," he said, eyes distant. "But something inside wants to be noticed. People who get curious, they hear it, whispering, sometimes even footsteps, always when it's dark, always when you're alone." I laughed nervously, but the sound felt hollow, echoing unnaturally in the empty lobby. My curiosity prickled like tiny electric shocks along my spine. The storm outside seemed louder, as though it had caught my attention and was listening too. "So, no one's gone in?" "Not in my time," he said, shrugging. "I've worked nights here for 10 years, never seen anyone try, never saw anyone come back with anything useful, just rumors, stories left in whispers by those brave enough to ask." He paused, a faint smile flickering. "Brave or foolish, sometimes I can't tell the difference." I leaned closer, drawn by the mystery. "And the key, where is it?" His hand drifted across the counter, resting on a small brass key that gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Some say it's cursed, others just say it's forgotten. I keep it here, just in case someone wants to see for themselves." I hesitated. Something in his eyes, or maybe in the hotel itself, made me feel the weight of the choice before me. It wasn't just a key. It was a decision. One turn, one step, and who knew what waited behind that door? I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but the tug of curiosity was stronger than my fear. He leaned back, voice dropping to a whisper. They say the room doesn't stay still, not like the others. The furniture shifts, shadows move differently, and those who peek inside rarely leave unchanged. I swallowed hard. My mind ran through images of empty halls, dimly lit corridors, and the faint memory of a mirror eye, passed earlier on the way to the lobby. What if room 13 was like that? A place that wasn't entirely real, or was real in ways the mind couldn't fully grasp. Has anyone, I trailed off, my stomach nodding, gone inside and come back? He shook his head slowly. No one, not really. Only stories. Whispers of cleaners who stayed too late, of guests who wandered when the corridors were quiet. A janitor once said he heard someone singing in there, though no one was supposed to be. Another claimed he saw a light flicker, even though the hotel had no electricity in that wing for decades. I leaned back, trying to process what he said. The lobby felt smaller suddenly, walls pressing closer. The storm outside had softened to a dull patter, yet the tension inside me amplified every sound. The wind against the windows, the tick of the old clock behind the desk, even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Why keep it locked? I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper. Some things are better left undisturbed, he replied. Curiosity is dangerous. It drags the living into places that were never meant for them. The hotel has memories, old memories. Room 13, it has more than its share. I shivered despite the layers of my jacket. Something about the way he spoke made the shadows in the corners of the lobby seem darker, heavier. I wanted to ask more, to press for details, but a sudden chill ran through me, cold as wet stone. I realized the storm wasn't the only thing outside. Something else waited, patient, hidden, and aware. He leaned forward again, voice so low I almost missed it. Sometimes, when the night is long, you can hear it. A key turning in the lock that isn't there. A door creaking open, though no one is near. And if you listen too long, you can hear it calling your name. My throat went dry. The hair on my arm stood on end. I felt a tremor run through the hotel, subtle but undeniable, like a heartbeat beneath the floors. I wanted to leave the topic, step away from the counter, retreat to the safety of my temporary apartment across town. But the key glinted in the dim light, brass catching the shadows like it knew I was watching. I reached out almost involuntarily. My fingers hovered above the cold metal. I could feel its weight, not just physically, but in the air around me, as though it carried history, memory, and intent. One turn, one push, and the barrier of decades could fall. One step, and I could see what had been hidden for so long. Careful, he said softly. The first step isn't the hardest. It's what comes after. Once you open that door, you're not sure where the hotel ends and where it begins. I drew my hand back, heart racing. My pulse pounded in my ears, matching the slow rhythm I imagined the hotel itself maintained. I wanted to laugh, to call it theatrics, but the weight of decades pressed down in the quiet corners. I felt small, insignificant, but also awake in a way I hadn't before. Every creak of the floor, every flutter of shadow seemed magnified. The lobby light flickered. A soft gust moved through the room, though the doors were closed. My fingers itched to touch the key again, to turn it, to see room 13 with my own eyes. The clerk leaned back, fingers intertwined, expression neutral but eyes glimmering with something I couldn't name. Patience, expectation, a quiet warning. I stepped back from the counter, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The key remained where he had placed it, gleaming faintly, a promise of secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Yet even as I moved away, curiosity pulled at me, whispering with the same tone the clerk had used. Some things are locked for a reason, and yet, aren't we always drawn to what's forbidden? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the key glinting under the dim lobby light. Every time I breathed, I imagined a door, a shadow, a room waiting patient for someone curious enough to cross the threshold. The whispers of past guests, the rumors, the faint stories of vanished souls, all of it lingered in my mind. And I knew deep down that eventually I would find myself standing in front of that door, one hand on the cold brass, one turn, one step inside. Until then, room 13 waited, patient, silent, watching. The door to room 13 was heavier than I expected, a thick slab of wood that seemed to resist my touch, as if it knew I wasn't meant to enter. The key trembled slightly in my hand, though the brass was cold and solid. I slid it into the lock, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then it clicked. The sound echoed in the hall, sharp and final, as if the lock itself sighed in relief or in warning. I pushed the door open slowly. The room exhaled with me, a musty breath that smelled of dust, old paper, and something faintly metallic like blood long dried. Light from the hallway barely penetrated, leaving corners shadowed and indistinct. The storm outside had quieted to a drizzle, but here, inside the room, the silence was absolute. No hum, no wind, no creak. Only the faint, subtle murmur that I couldn't place at first. The furniture was faded, threadbare, as if decades of neglect had worn it to husks. A chair sagged in one corner, peeling upholstery revealing splintered wood beneath. A dresser leaned slightly, its drawers warped, some half open as though someone had left in a hurry or had been pulled away. The wallpaper, yellowed and curling at the edges, had marks, streaks that could have been water or hands or something more deliberate. I moved closer to the wall, tracing a line of discoloration with my fingers. The texture was rough, raised in places, like faint whispers etched into the plaster. I realized then that the room seemed alive with memory. Not the hotel's memory, but a more intimate one. It remembered someone else, someone who had existed here, whose presence had left an indelible mark. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my awareness, a lingering pulse beneath the faded paint. Every surface held fragments, tiny clues. A glass tipped on its side, long dried streaks on the floorboards, a coat draped over the back of the chair that wasn't mine. And then the whispers began, soft, barely audible, curling through the room. Not words at first, just breath-like noises as though the walls themselves were exhaling. I pressed my ear to the dresser and caught a syllable, something like, "Stay." It vanished the instant I focused on it, leaving only the sensation that someone or something was observing me, analyzing my reaction, patient and still. I moved further into the room. The air was cold, and with each step the whispers grew slightly louder, weaving around the room like a slow current. I stopped by the bed. The mattress was thin, sagged at the center, stained with time and neglect. A faint imprint in the sheets suggested someone had lain here recently, or perhaps long ago, and the room refused to forget. I touched it lightly, and a shiver ran through me. There was sorrow here, something heavy and unyielding, trapped in the fibers of the air. A photograph on the nightstand caught my attention. A man seated at a desk, staring out a window with hollow eyes. His expression was calm, almost serene, but the edges of the photo were warped, scratched, as if it had been handled roughly or pressed against something unseen. I picked it up. Behind the glass, faint words had been scratched. "Never leave, never leave." My stomach twisted. The repetition felt obsessive, a warning or a record of despair. I set the photograph down gently. The whispers shifted in response, forming syllables I could almost understand. "Gone, gone, remain." The language was broken, fractured, as though it had been caught between worlds. I leaned closer to the wallpaper, pressing my palm against it. A faint warmth radiated from the wall itself, subtle, almost imperceptible. But I felt it, the presence of someone who had lingered here far longer than anyone should, whose story had never ended. I explored the corners. A wardrobe door, cracked and splintered, revealed the faintest hint of clothing inside. Dust motes swirled as I opened it, catching light from the small, grimy window. The garments were old, simple coats, shirts, but one set of clothing seemed different, fresher somehow, as though someone had moved through the room recently. My heartbeat quickened. I wasn't sure if it was imagination or memory, but I felt the weight of a life that had passed too close, too fully to this room. The whispers became words, slightly clearer now, forming sentences in the edge of my mind. I waited, they never came. I froze. I hadn't noticed at first, but the sound wasn't external. It was inside me, curling around my thoughts, filling the room with a narrative I couldn't escape. Someone had waited here, and they had waited alone, until the line between presence and absence had blurred. I moved to the window, wiping a streak of grime away to look outside. The storm had passed entirely. Moonlight spilled over the grounds, illuminating a garden long overgrown, weeds curling around cracked paths. It should have been peaceful, almost picturesque, but the shadows here felt different, heavier, filled with expectation. The room seemed to pulse with the memory of footsteps, of laughter that had never reached my ears, of a guest who had arrived and never left. I turned back to the room. The furniture seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at it. A chair that had been near the dresser now leaned closer to the bed. The air was thicker, heavier, as though someone unseen had moved through it. I wanted to step back, to retreat, but the whispers pulled me closer, demanding attention. I could feel the story assembling itself around me, fragment by fragment, like puzzle pieces scattered across decades. A journal lay half buried under the bedspread. Dust covered its leather, cracked and brittle. I lifted it carefully. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwriting that wavered, hesitant in places, frantic in others. It told the story of a guest who had arrived one night decades before, expecting nothing more than rest, and who had never departed. There were details of meals left untouched, of attempts to leave blocked by strange circumstances, of dreams that bled into waking life, until the line between the room and the man had disappeared. I shivered, setting the journal down on the nightstand. The whispers circled, weaving a delicate pattern of sound that almost felt musical. Stay, understand. My mind swirled with the fragments of the story, the echoes of a life trapped, and I realized the room itself had been speaking, telling me what had happened without a single voice raised in anger or despair. It was patient. It waited for me to notice, for me to understand. A gust of wind pressed against the window, rattling the panes. I turned, expecting intrusion from outside, but the garden remained empty. Yet I felt eyes on me, as though the room had a gaze that reached from the walls into my very chest. I realized with sudden clarity that the room didn't just remember the guest. It remembered me now. It had registered my presence, noted my curiosity, and was beginning its slow, careful examination. I approached the bed again, tracing the outline of the figure who had once lain there. The fabric gave slightly beneath my fingers, and the whispering reached a crescendo, almost impatient now. See, no, wait, the words weren't accusatory. They weren't angry. They were insistently gentle, a guidance, a pull toward something I couldn't yet grasp. I felt compelled, drawn toward the dresser where the mirror leaned, long neglected. The reflection was fractured, stained with age, but I caught movement in it. Not my own, something else shifted just beyond the corner of my vision. A silhouette, faint, hesitant, and impossibly thin, as though someone had stretched beyond their physical form to remain in the room. My stomach twisted. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Only the whispering remained, softer now, patient again, urging me to continue piecing together the story. I sank to the floor, the journal in my lap. Each page revealed another fragment. Meals eaten alone, conversations with imagined voices, attempts to leave, and the walls responding in silence, closing in, waiting. I realized the room had its own rhythm, its own consciousness, and I had entered into it. Every creak of the floor, every shiver of air, every movement of the shadows was a language I had only begun to understand. Hours seemed to pass, though the moonlight had not shifted. My awareness of time blurred as the room whispered and breathed around me. And through it all, one realization crystallized. The guest had never left because the room had never let them. They had become part of it, stitched into its walls, its furniture, its whispers. And I, curiosity unguarded, was now on the same path. The journal closed softly, though I hadn't moved it. A single sentence lingered in my mind, repeating, "Understand or become like me." I shivered, heart hammering, aware that the room had already started weaving me into its memory. The whispers faded to a low hum, almost a lullaby, but the weight of presence remained, patient and unrelenting. I stood, brushing dust from my sleeves, the sense of being watched now undeniable. The furniture, the walls, the shadows, they all seemed to lean slightly, attentive, waiting for my next move. The room had revealed its story in fragments and I had listened. But the story was not complete. It would continue and I would continue with it, for the room's patience was long and its memory eternal. I stepped toward the door, glancing once more over the room. Faded furniture, peeling wallpaper, the whispering walls, they held a tragic story, a life that had lingered far too long. And now I knew I had added myself to it, a new fragment in a tale that never truly ended. Outside, the hallway awaited. The key still glinted in my pocket, a reminder that some doors are forbidden for a reason, and that curiosity comes at a cost. But for now, the room whispered its farewells in soft murmurs, patient as ever, knowing that stories like this are never finished. They only wait for the next listener. I thought leaving would be simple. The key in my pocket felt heavy, a weight that seemed to pull against my hand. The door to room 13 stood before me, the same door I had pushed open hours ago, yet now it seemed different. Subtle differences I couldn't immediately name, edges sharper, grain darker, the knob set a fraction higher. I shook the thought off. My mind was tired, overstuffed with whispers and the stories stitched into the room's walls. All I wanted was to step back into the hallway and feel normal air against my skin again. I turned the knob. It resisted slightly, then gave way. I pushed, expecting the corridor, but stopped. Something was wrong. The hallway stretched in a way it hadn't before. The wall that had been to my right, it had shifted. A door that had led nowhere now glimmered faintly in the dim light. I blinked. The hallway's ceiling seemed lower, pressing down subtly, bending light and shadow into shapes that made my stomach twist. I realized then that the hotel itself was watching, attentive to every step, every thought, every flicker of hesitation. I stepped forward, careful. Each footfall echoed differently than before, hollow and slightly delayed, as if the floorboards themselves were marking time in some private rhythm. The shadows shifted along the walls, not in the usual way caused by light, but independently. I could feel them tracing me, assessing me, patient and slow, not attacking, not threatening, but undeniable in presence. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps fear, propelled me forward. The door on my left caught my eye. It wasn't there before. Its surface was polished, too polished, reflecting my own tired face back at me. I stared, feeling a sudden vertigo as though the reflection had a life of its own. My reflection didn't move entirely in sync. It hesitated on certain gestures, blinked slightly later than I did. My chest tightened. I felt the old pulse of presence I had sensed in room 13. The room itself had extended, spilling into the hallway, rewriting the space around me. I turned back to the door I thought was the exit. It had shifted farther than it should have been. My key, once sufficient, now felt useless, as if mocking me. The corridor twisted subtly, each step forward taking me farther from the hallway I thought I knew. My breath came fast, shallow. I paused, hands trembling, and for a moment thought about sitting on the floor, closing my eyes, pretending the room had no influence, pretending the hotel couldn't reach inside me. A whisper curled at the edges of my awareness. Not the faint, patient hum from room 13, but sharper, accusatory. "You should not leave," it said, almost amused. I froze, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, yet every inch of the hallway seemed to lean toward me. The wallpaper, peeling slightly, rippled as though breathing. The floorboards warped subtly beneath my feet. The hotel was alive, and it had noticed me. I took another step, trying to force rational thought into my panic. Hotels are full of quirks, strange architecture, uneven floors. Yes, I could explain this. But my rationalizations died in the air as the next door I passed gave a soft creak, an unmistakable sound of intention. The door hadn't moved on its own before. Now it shifted slightly with every step I took, as though following, watching. I felt the same presence from room 13 pressing against me, insistent and almost personal. I tried to recall how many doors lined this corridor. There were 7. No, 8. My memory of the hallway was unreliable now. It bent with each moment, the exits hiding in plain sight, mocking my certainty. I reached for the wall for balance, brushing against the wallpaper. It was cool and sticky, almost clammy. Faintly, it seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips, like the heartbeat of the building itself. I realized the hotel didn't just contain stories, it remembered, it reacted, it judged. The exit door glimmered faintly ahead. I ran toward it, faster this time, ignoring the shadows stretching along the walls like long fingers. But each step brought a subtle resistance. The door did not draw nearer as I moved. It remained the same distance away, distant and unyielding. My heart raced, my breath short. I felt the accusing presence behind me growing, a patient weight pressing through the floor and walls. The hotel was speaking without words, a language of subtle motion, of shadows and pressure. A low, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A shuffling, not quite footsteps, but the sensation that someone was moving just behind me, mirroring my motion. I dared a glance backward. The corridor stretched endlessly empty. Nothing there. But the feeling, the undeniable sense of being followed remained. The shadows elongated, merging with the edges of the floorboards, creeping closer in my peripheral vision. I realized the hotel had learned I wanted to leave, and it was testing me. I tried the exit door. Locked. No, not locked in the traditional sense. It simply would not open. The handle resisted, cool metal mocking my attempts. My hand shook violently. The whisper returned, sharper this time, almost giddy. Curiosity brought you here. Leaving is not the plan. I staggered back, heart thundering. Every instinct screamed to fight, to retreat, to abandon logic and escape. But where could I go when the space itself bent and twisted, rejecting my movement? I glanced around the corridor. Another door, the one I had passed earlier, shimmered faintly. I approached, hand outstretched. The surface was warm, pulsing slightly under my palm. A soft voice, like someone whispering into the room decades ago, spoke in fragments. Understand or remain, my stomach churned. The hotel was not just walls and rooms. It was a sentience, patient, slow, and impossible to outrun. Every shadow, every creak, every subtle tilt of a doorframe was deliberate, a methodical test of my resolve. I backed away, realizing the hallway itself was a trap. Not a trap in the violent sense, but a slow, methodical challenge. The building would allow me movement, but only what it permitted. Each door, each shadow, each whisper was a lesson, a measure. I felt exposed, yet aware that any overt action would shift the environment further, bending reality in response to my fear. The hotel had absorbed room 13, and now it had absorbed me. I tried counting doors again, moving along the wall, trying to find a familiar marker. My mind refused. The floorboards tilted slightly beneath my weight, walls subtly leaning, lights dimming and brightening with no pattern. I realized that leaving had never been promised. The hotel wanted something: attention, recognition, and acknowledgement of the stories it held. Room 13 had been a beginning. The corridor was a continuation, a slow lesson in patience, in fear, in the pliability of perception. I stopped, listening. The shadows no longer moved. The air held its breath, and in that silence I understood something chilling. The hotel had shifted itself around me not to trap me exactly, but to teach me. Every whisper, every warped doorway, every subtle pressure of the walls was a message. I had entered into its memory, and it expected me to navigate without destroying the delicate balance it maintained. A sudden draft, faint but tangible, pressed against my back. I turned slowly, expecting intrusion. Nothing. Yet I felt it, the presence of someone or something behind me, observing, waiting. A whisper brushed my mind. Do you understand? I swallowed hard. I didn't, not fully. But the corridors, the doors, the shifting shadows had revealed part of the truth. The hotel was alive in the only way that mattered. Patient, silent, eternal, and hungry for attention. I moved again toward the exit, slower now, careful. Each step measured, deliberate. The doors shifted in response, the hallway breathing around me. I was aware that leaving might never be a final act. The building had begun marking me as it had marked the guest of room 13. My presence, my thoughts, my fear, all woven subtly into the fabric of the walls. A low, constant hum filled the air, almost comforting in its consistency, but it reminded me that patience was infinite here. Mine was not. Finally, I reached the door I had first identified as the exit. It seemed normal now, aligned with the hallway as I remembered. My hand touched the handle, warm, alive. I paused, realizing that the act of opening it was an acknowledgement, a bargain I was entering with this place. I took a deep breath, half expecting the corridor to bend, to shift, to punish me for my audacity. The door opened smoothly. The hallway beyond looked as it had when I first arrived, ordinary and still. Relief flooded me, tempered with the lingering knowledge that the building's presence followed, patient, ever present. I stepped through, feeling the air change, but aware that the hotel had left its mark. Room 13, the whispers, the shifting corridors, all were stitched into my perception now, and I knew I carried part of it with me. I glanced back once, fleetingly. The corridor seemed static, calm. Yet in the shadows, faintly, I could swear I saw a figure pause just beyond my vision, waiting. I didn't look again. I walked forward, heart still pounding, key in pocket, mind alert. The hotel had allowed me a step into freedom, but it had not relinquished its claim entirely. I would carry the memory of it, patient and accusatory, always whispering in the edges of my thoughts. The door clicked shut behind me, and the hallway beyond felt ordinary. But the memory of shifting walls, of subtle judgment of the corridor alive, remained. And I understood fully that some places never let you leave completely. They only allow you to think you have, while a piece of you lingers in the shadows, patient and waiting, for the next whisper, the next visitor, the next story to unfold. I had always thought night shifts were boring, predictable, almost comforting in their monotony, until tonight. The hotel lobby stretched before me like a theater stage frozen between acts. Its polished marble floors reflected the dim ceiling lights in long, wavering streaks. I walked carefully, my shoes whispering against the stone, and something caught my eye immediately, a reflection that didn't match my movement. I froze. I had passed beneath these chandeliers hundreds of times, but now the light seemed sharper, crueler. In the gloss of the floor, a figure flickered, not my own, just a shadow at first, like a trick of the lighting, but it moved independently. I took a slow step back and it stepped forward. My heartbeat quickened. I blinked. Nothing. The floor looked normal again, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night was quiet, too quiet. I heard the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of a radiator sighing, the tick of the antique clock behind the reception desk. Then laughter. Soft, distant, impossibly casual laughter. I looked toward the hallways branching from the lobby. Empty. The echo curled around the walls like smoke, intangible but unmistakable. I swallowed hard. Who could be wandering here at this hour? I tried to dismiss it. Old buildings made noises. Old pipes creaked. The floor reflected shadows in ways my mind misread. But the laughter returned, closer this time, light, playful, and entirely wrong for an empty hotel. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I reached for the front desk, running a hand along its smooth wood, grounding myself. The desk was ordinary, but the air around it carried a faint chill. A whisper of movement, a presence just beyond my vision. I walked toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms. My shoes echoed too loudly, betraying my nervousness. Each door I passed seemed normal, yet each reflection in the polished floor hinted at someone else moving behind me. A shadow darted at the corner of my eye, gone before I could fully see it. I forced a laugh, telling myself I was imagining things. But the laughter followed, a soft, patient rhythm that teased the edges of my awareness. I stopped near the grand staircase. The handrail gleamed under the dim light, perfectly polished. My reflection in the glossy wood seemed normal at first, but then I noticed it blinked slightly after I did, a fraction of a second too late. My pulse skipped. I stared, unwilling to move yet unable to look away. The lobby felt different now, somehow deeper, as if the floor itself had grown taller, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the corners. The clock struck midnight. Its chime echoed through the cavernous lobby, each note lingering, dragging the silence behind it. I realized that for a few seconds the laughter stopped. Complete quiet. I exhaled slowly, thinking I had imagined everything. But then a soft scrape reached my ears. Someone or something was moving just past the reception desk. I whipped around. Empty. Nothing. Yet the air carried a faint warmth, like a presence pressing against the edges of perception. I tried to focus on the mundane. polishing the brass bell on the desk, straightening brochures, checking room logs. Routine tasks that normally gave comfort, but each movement seemed amplified, watched. I could feel the lobby shifting subtly, the ceiling a fraction lower, the chandeliers tilting ever so slightly. The reflections on the floor warped. I saw long stretches of the marble that didn't exist when I looked directly at them. Shapes lingered there, indistinct but undeniable. The laughter returned, closer now, and with it came the faintest whisper. "Hello," I froze. Not a voice I recognized, no tone that matched any guest or staff member. It was soft, curious, but underneath, a note of knowing. I turned slowly toward the corridor leading to the elevators. Empty. My footsteps felt heavier now, pressing into the stone as though the floor was measuring my intent. The lobby itself seemed alive, reacting to me. I took the service elevator down to the basement for a routine check. The walls of the shaft reflected the flickering lights, stretching them into impossible lengths. For a moment I thought I saw a figure descending with me in the mirrored panels. When I blinked, nothing. Yet the sensation persisted, someone riding unseen just behind the veil of reality. The elevator jolted softly as it reached the basement. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart. Perhaps it was just the old mechanism. Perhaps. In the basement, I performed the usual inspection. Storage rooms, utility closets, boiler room. Everything was normal, yet a subtle tension clung to the air. The shadows hung differently here, heavier, stretching along the walls with a purpose. I could hear a faint hum, low and rhythmic, not mechanical, not electrical, but almost alive. My pulse quickened. I wondered if the hotel remembered all the people who had passed through its halls, all the secrets it had swallowed. I returned to the lobby, ascending the grand staircase slowly. The laughter had returned, quieter now, almost teasing. It wrapped around me, rising and falling like a tide. I tried to focus on the familiar, the reception desk, the polished floors, the velvet rope at the entrance. But the reflections shifted again, showing more than just light. Shapes lingered at the edges of vision. A fleeting movement just behind a column, the suggestion of a figure watching me from the hallway beyond the elevators. I stopped near the center of the lobby, breath shallow. The lights flickered faintly, not enough to be noticed at first, but enough to draw my eyes upward. Shadows danced along the ceiling, shifting in ways that didn't match the chandeliers. I realized I could feel them, not just see them. Pressing against me softly, patient, like the building itself was aware I was here, aware of my thoughts, my curiosity, my fear. I shivered, pulling my jacket closer. The laughter ceased abruptly, complete silence. And then the softest sound, scraping of shoes against marble, moving in the lobby, approaching from the far end. My instincts screamed to run, yet I felt rooted, mesmerized. I couldn't pinpoint the source. I wanted to call out, but my voice stuck in my throat. The floor reflected the empty lobby perfectly, yet I could sense the presence walking along with me, unseen but undeniable. I moved toward the elevator lobby, each step deliberate. The shadows shifted in response, stretching along the walls, merging, separating. I passed the mirrored walls again and caught a glimpse, my own reflection, but behind me the outline of a figure standing just beyond the edges. I blinked and it was gone, but I knew it had been there. I felt it in the air, in the subtle draft brushing my neck, in the almost imperceptible weight pressing against my chest. I reached the elevators and pressed the button for the upper floors. The panel lit with a soft hum, and I thought I saw another shadow flicker across the polished steel doors. The reflection showed nothing when I looked directly, yet the sensation persisted. Someone, was moving in tandem with me, just out of reach of my vision. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself. Perhaps the old hotel simply played tricks on night clerks. Perhaps imagination was my only enemy. The elevator doors opened on the upper floors, quiet and ordinary. The hallways stretched before me, familiar yet different. Shadows seemed heavier here, lingering longer at corners, stretching into doors that led nowhere. I glanced back at the lobby far below. It looked ordinary now, still and quiet. But I knew better. I had felt the pulse of the building tonight, the subtle sentience, the awareness that followed me wherever I moved. I walked slowly down the hallway to my post at the reception desk, mind alert. Every door, every shadow, every polished floor reflected more than just light. I felt the presence of those who had walked these halls before me, their whispers echoing faintly, absorbed into the very air. The hotel was a living memory, patient and subtle, observing, responding, marking. And now I was part of it, even if I didn't yet understand how. By the time my shift ended, the sun had begun to rise. Light poured into the lobby, chasing the shadows into corners, dissolving them into the polished marble. The reflections were normal again. The laughter, the whispers, the subtle pressure of presence, all seemed gone. I left the lobby slowly, key in hand, but I knew. The hotel had left its mark on me. I would feel it again at night, in quiet moments, in reflections where no one should be. It was patient, it was subtle, and it would wait. And I would return because night shifts were part of my life. And the hotel, it had learned I was curious, and curiosity never leaves quietly. I had been organizing the guest logs for hours, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The old ledger felt heavy in my hands, its leather cracked and fragile. Dust rose from the pages in tiny clouds, catching the thin slant of light from the desk lamp. I turned to the first page and froze. Names I knew, names I remembered, and yet they were dated decades apart. The same guests, apparently checking in again and again, as if time had little meaning here. I traced a finger along the inked letters. Mr. Carlyle, room 214, March 1932. I blinked. Then again, room 214, March 1967. The same man, same name. Same polite signature curling at the bottom. My stomach tightened. I had only ever met one Mr. Carlyle, a guest last year who had stayed a week and left quietly, like all the rest. But here, decades of his presence were recorded as if he never truly left. The air around me grew cooler, and I realized the lamp's light was flickering in irregular pulses. I leaned closer to the ledger, trying to steady my thoughts. A faint sound brushed against my ears, a slow shuffle, soft, deliberate. I looked up. The hallway beyond the office door was empty. Nothing moved. Yet a chill pressed against the nape of my neck, a weight I couldn't shrug off. I turned the page, and more names leapt from the paper with a strange familiarity. Mrs. Holloway, room 317. She had been charming, anxious, utterly ordinary when she stayed. I had handed her a key myself. Yet here she was, dated 1921, 1948, 1983. My hands trembled. These were guests who never checked out, I realized with a sinking clarity. Or maybe they had, but not in the way I understood checkouts to work. I felt a presence shift behind me, not directly visible but undeniably there. The faintest pressure of air, a whisper of motion across the back of my neck. I turned slowly. Nothing. Yet the feeling didn't fade, it intensified. Each name in the ledger now seemed to pulse faintly, as if reacting to me, acknowledging my attention. A soft, almost imperceptible giggle echoed through the office. I froze. The sound was playful, curious, but the tone carried something else, something patient, like a warning. I tried to rationalize. This hotel was old. People stayed, returned, their names recorded again. Coincidences, that must be it. Yet every instinct in me refused to settle. I traced the names again. Room 214, room 317. And suddenly I noticed it, beside each name, faint marks in the margin. Not scribbles, but impressions, like something had pressed the page. I leaned closer. The indentations formed shapes, faces, eyes staring back at me from decades past. My throat went dry. A memory brushed against my mind unbidden. Last week I had passed a guest in the lobby. A woman who smiled politely, thanked me for directions. Later I realized she hadn't been listed in any current guest log. But her face now seemed familiar, echoing the faint sketches in the ledger margins. I shook my head. Impossible. I couldn't know everyone in the city, yet here her face haunted me, etched across years I hadn't lived. I flipped further, and the ledger revealed something more disturbing. Some entries were blank, dates without names, rooms occupied, receipts tallied, yet no one signed. And yet I could feel them in the office. The air thickened, carrying the faint scent of old perfume, cigar smoke, polished shoes. I couldn't see anyone, but the sense of bodies pressing subtly against the space around me was undeniable. I leaned back, trying to catch my breath. My mind sought reason in routine, in logic. Maybe the hotel kept duplicates of past logs copied through decades. Maybe it was poor record keeping. But the whispers returned, soft and urgent. A woman's voice, polite, insistent, just on the edge of understanding. "Do you see us?" it asked, almost a question, almost a demand. I froze. A flicker caught my eye, the reflection of the office door in the polished ledger cover. Someone stood there or had just passed. I couldn't be certain. Shadows stretched, elongating unnaturally across the floor. Each time I moved to look directly, the figure dissolved, only to reappear behind my peripheral vision. My pulse hammered. I could almost imagine them watching, waiting for me to acknowledge the impossible. I forced myself to focus again on the ledger. One name after another, repeating across decades, yet each encounter I had personally experienced felt impossibly recent. Mr. Carlyle's polite nod, Mrs. Holloway's anxious glance, the soft bow of the gentleman who had lingered at the lobby desk 5 nights ago, all of it replaying against these pages. How could the same people exist across decades? And why did it feel like they knew I was here, that they had been waiting for me to notice? The office light flickered violently. Shadows pooled in corners. My reflection in the window across the desk showed only me, but a second glance revealed a subtle distortion. Eyes too dark, a face too still, lingering just behind mine. I spun around. Nothing. But the air was heavier and the faintest pressure brushed against my shoulder, a contact unseen, remembered. I tried to leave the office, to step back into the hallway, but the door seemed reluctant. My hand on the knob felt a subtle resistance, as if the room itself had remembered me too well. I tugged again, stronger, and it swung open with a quiet sigh. The hallway stretched endlessly, the light dimmer than I remembered. Shadows pooled along the edges, pressing against walls in a silent, patient audience. I moved cautiously, footsteps measured. Each room I passed seemed aware. I glimpsed a reflection in a polished doorknob, a guest seated in a chair I knew I had never placed anyone in. Her eyes met mine, polite, curious. Then she vanished. I blinked. Nothing. Yet I could feel her gaze still pressing gently against my chest, tracking my movements, measuring my fear. The hallway opened into the lobby again. Everything seemed ordinary at first glance, polished marble and familiar furniture. But I could feel it, the subtle distortion of time, the repetition of names, the patient gaze of those who had never truly left. I shivered. The laughter from last night's shift drifted faintly across the lobby, carried on air that smelled faintly of old perfume and polished shoes. I knew then that this hotel was alive in ways I could not explain. I returned to the ledger, compelled. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, looking for patterns, for answers. Some entries had dates that didn't exist, times that were impossible. The names of guests I had never met were scrawled in ink that seemed to shimmer faintly under the lamp. I realized with a rising sense of dread that the hotel's memory extended beyond my understanding. It remembered everything, everyone, and it allowed some to linger, unbound by the normal rules of life and death. I traced a final name, a guest who had supposedly stayed only last month. The entry was fresh, ink barely dry, and yet the name was accompanied by faint sketches, indistinct faces pressed into the paper, faces that seemed impossibly familiar. I leaned back, heart hammering. Each guest, each repetition felt like a warning, or an invitation. I wasn't sure which. The office felt colder now. Shadows pooled more heavily in corners, stretching subtly along the floor. I could feel the air thick with presence. The whispers had returned, a soft chorus now, polite but insistent, surrounding me from all directions. "Notice us," one breathed. "Remember," another sighed. "Stay." I wanted to run, but my curiosity, my obsession with the ledger held me frozen. I realized I had glimpsed the impossible. Guests who never checked out, returning across decades, echoing through the hotel in ways I could feel but could not fully see. And in some deep, unnameable part of me, I knew their awareness had shifted toward me. The ledger was a doorway, the repetitions a key, and I was now part of its record. I was noticed. I was acknowledged. As the first hint of dawn crept along the lobby windows, the shadows receded slightly. The whispers softened. I closed the ledger, heart pounding, and placed it carefully back on the desk. I could still feel them around me, lingering, patient, curious. Their presence was a weight I would carry, a story the hotel had invited me to witness. I stepped back from the desk, trying to breathe normally, trying to remind myself that daylight would chase away some of the unease. And yet I knew it wouldn't chase them away. Not entirely. The hotel remembered, and its guests, they never truly left. I didn't plan to take the elevator that night. It was tucked in a shadowed corner of the hotel, the brass doors tarnished, handles worn smooth by decades of touch. I had passed it 100 times, pushed the button out of habit, but tonight something drew me closer. A faint hum, almost a whisper vibrating through the marble floors. I hesitated, hand hovering over the button panel, then pressed. The doors slid open with a reluctant groan. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and candle smoke, the kind of scent that seeps into memory and never leaves. I stepped in. The panel had buttons I'd never noticed before, floors numbered beyond the hotel's known count. 12, 13, 14, 27, 47. The numbers weren't sequential. They weren't even real. I pressed 1, floor 27. The elevator shuddered and descended slowly, a grinding vibration crawling up my spine. The lights flickered. Shadows stretched along the walls, coiling like smoke. I had a strange sensation. Like the car itself was breathing, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't name. The doors opened onto a hallway that didn't exist. The wallpaper was familiar yet wrong, faded roses curling into shapes that seemed to move just out of sight. The carpet was plush, crimson and soft underfoot, but damp, as though it had absorbed decades of spilled memories. I stepped out, every nerve alert, my pulse a sharp drum. I heard at first murmurs, voices echoing faintly, overlapping, distorted. I couldn't place the words, only fragments. Why didn't you stay? She's still here. It was never meant to end. The sounds curled around me like smoke, winding down the corridor. My hands itched to reach for the walls, as though touching them would explain the whispers. I didn't. I didn't want the answers too close. A door ahead cracked open on its own. Through the sliver I saw a small parlor. A woman sat in a chair, pale and motionless, staring at a tea set on the table. I remembered her. Or at least I thought I did. A guest, maybe 100 years ago, maybe last week. Her eyes were empty yet heavy with recognition, like she had been waiting for me all along. I swallowed, my throat tight. I stepped closer, and the moment I moved, the scene fractured. The walls of the parlor blurred, the furniture stretching unnaturally. The woman's face twisted briefly into anguish before vanishing entirely, replaced by a dark hallway filled with laughter that didn't belong to anyone living. I blinked. The elevator doors materialized at the far end of the corridor, reflecting light that shouldn't exist here. I ran back, heart hammering, and the elevator doors closed silently behind me. I pressed another button, 14. The car descended again, slower this time, deeper, as if resisting my curiosity. The hum intensified, vibrating through my chest, mingling with the rapid beat of my pulse. When the doors opened, the floor was empty. The air was thick, scentless. A lone window overlooked the city below, or a version of it I didn't recognize. Shadows moved against the panes, tiny figures drifting on rooftops, fatting before I could focus. The silence was suffocating. I could almost hear the building itself breathing, each exhale a whisper of sorrow, regret, memory. Then I saw it, a small journal lying open on the floor. The pages fluttered though no wind stirred. I picked it up. The handwriting was uneven, fragmented, names and dates repeating, much like the guest ledger I had studied earlier. Stories of tragedies, small losses, lives that ended or vanished within the hotel's walls. Some of the entries matched the echoes I had just heard. I felt a pull, a gravity I couldn't resist. I turned the pages slowly, each one heavier than the last. Children who had wandered into rooms and never returned. Guests who had booked for one night and were never recorded leaving. Staff notes that faded into scribbles, warnings disguised as instructions. Every word seemed alive, vibrating faintly against my fingertips. The air around me thickened again, shadows pooling like ink at my feet. A sudden noise, a creak from above. I froze, not in the elevator. The sound came from the ceiling of this floor, high and echoing, followed by a soft scrape like fingernails along wood. I could feel eyes on me. The journal fell from my hands, pages flipping open to a drawing, a figure reaching for a door that didn't exist. The drawing shifted as I watched, the figure's hand curling toward me, almost breaking the paper. I backed away, my heart slamming. The window shattered without sound, glass hanging in midair, reflecting fragments of rooms that weren't there. Faces appeared briefly in the shards, some angry, some sorrowful, some blank, and each seemed to recognize me. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. I pressed the elevator button again, frantic. 12. The doors groaned open. This time the floor was a ballroom. Dusty chandeliers swung gently, though there was no breeze. Chairs sat in rows, empty, facing a stage. On the stage, figures in tuxedos and gowns moved slowly, a dance I couldn't follow. Their faces were blurred, features melting like wax. I wanted to speak, to ask what this place was, but the words stuck in my throat. Their eyes, if I could call them that, found me. Recognition, accusation, longing. It was impossible to distinguish. I stumbled back into the elevator, hands pressed to the brass walls. I could feel warmth, almost human, pulsing through the metal, a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The hum changed, rhythmic now, like breathing or footsteps echoing down an endless corridor. I pressed 27 again, desperate to retrace my path, to escape, to understand. The doors opened to a kitchen, pristine and sterile, though years of neglect should have left it in ruin. Pots and pans floated just above their hooks. Steam rose from empty stovetops, curling in spirals that formed faces. I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in a pan, eyes wide, pale, hollowed. And behind me in the reflection stood someone I knew, or thought I did. A bellboy like me, starring silently, repeating gestures I had made decades before, or would make decades after. My stomach churned. I slammed the elevator door closed, shaking. My hands left bruises on the panel as I pressed random numbers, hopping to return to the lobby, to any familiar place. But the elevator obeyed slowly, reluctantly, and the numbers shifted under my fingers. Each floor I passed was unrecognizable. Some contained corridors lined with photographs of guests who vanished. Others, rooms filled with objects I remembered leaving behind, or had never touched. Memory blurred into reality. I realized then that the elevator wasn't moving in space. It was moving in time, or maybe in something more abstract: memory, sorrow, absence. Each floor a fragment, a trapped echo of the hotel's past. And each echo watched me, recorded me, acknowledged me. I was no longer just an observer. I had become a participant. I pressed the lobby floor, willing it to appear. The car shuddered violently, lights flickering, a low hum vibrating through the walls, and then suddenly silence. I opened my eyes to find the lobby polished and bright, exactly as it should have been. No shadows lingered, no whispers brushed my ears. I exhaled shakily. Relief washed over me, thin and fleeting. But in the polished reflection of the front desk I caught it. Movement behind me. A flash of uniform, a bellboy I had never seen. Or had I? His eyes were empty yet aware. He smiled faintly, tipping his cap in a gesture I recognized too well. And then he vanished. I stepped back from the reflection, hand trembling on the ledger that still lay on the counter. The hotel seemed ordinary again, but I knew it was. The elevator waited somewhere, patiently, humming, ready to show me more. And I knew deep down that I would return, that the floors would call, the whispers would lure me again, because the hotel remembered everything. And those who had never checked out would never let me forget. I woke to the smell first. Not the sharp tang of burning, not the acrid sting of something smoldering, but a faint, lingering smoke that didn't belong to anything alive. It wrapped around the hallway like a thin fog, curling under the closed doors, settling in corners where dust never lay. I paused, breath catching, trying to place it. I shouldn't have been able to. Nothing was burning. Nothing had burned. The corridor was empty. The hotel, or this version of it, held its usual stillness. But tonight it felt alive in ways I didn't understand. Each step I took pressed my shoes into the worn carpet, and the smell followed, subtle but persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. I tried the first door on the left. Inside, the room was frozen. Furniture layered in dust, yet every object seemed staged, waiting. A chair tilted slightly as if someone had risen moments ago. A cup on the nightstand still held tea, dark and thick, crusted at the rim. The air was warm here, though no heater ran, and I could see my own breath mist faintly. Something about the stillness made it alive. I leaned closer to the cup. The smell of smoke was stronger here, curling from nowhere, yet unmistakable. I stepped back and scanned the room. The wallpaper had peeled away in jagged strips, revealing older paper underneath, patterns unfamiliar yet vaguely familiar. Faces, maybe. Shapes that my brain couldn't decide were stains or figures, frozen mid-motion. I realized I was holding my breath. I hadn't noticed. I moved to the window. Outside, the city looked like mine, but wrong. Streets were empty, lights dimmed, reflections glimmering in puddles that hadn't been there before. And then I saw him, an outline crouched in the street below, watching. I blinked. Gone. No footprints. No shadows, just the smell of smoke lingering. I left the room and tried another. This one smelled worse, closer, almost suffocating. The air was heavy, thick as if inhaling it might pull me under. A bed lay made perfectly, as if someone had just stepped away. But the sheets were creased in odd patterns, indentations where a body had rested for far too long. I traced a finger along the edge. Dust shifted like tiny waves, then froze again. A picture frame tilted toward me, glass catching the flickering hallway light. I leaned closer. A man in a suit stared back. His eyes, they weren't just eyes. They were waiting, watching, expecting. I had to move. My legs shook as I stepped back into the hall. The elevator hummed softly at the far end, doors closed, buttons blinking as though impatient. I considered it, then shook my head. Not yet. Not until I understood what these rooms wanted. The next door swung open before I touched it. I stumbled back, heart hammering. Smoke curled in lazy spirals above a small sitting room. A fire had clearly been here once long ago, but the embers were gone, ash swept clean, yet the scent remained. And in the chair a figure sat. Not moving, not breathing. A woman. Her hand rested on a ledger, eyes fixed somewhere behind me, past me, through me. I spoke quietly. Are you real? No reply, not a breath. But the air shifted, thickened, carrying whispers like coals crackling in a hearth. Names. I couldn't make them out, only fragments. Don't leave, stay. It's not your time. We remember. I forced my eyes to the ledger. The pages were blank, or should have been, but words bled faintly through the paper. Names, dates, fragments of notes. Guests who had stayed decades ago. Names I'd seen in the old ledger downstairs. Names repeated, layered, as if time folded them over each other until they blurred. I realized with a growing sense of dread that the woman, she remembered all of them. And now she remembered me. I stumbled back into the hall, hands pressed to the walls for balance. My pulse was loud, ears ringing. The hallway stretched further than it had before. Doors that hadn't existed appeared along the carpeted corridor. I caught movement behind one, a flicker of a shadow slipping just beyond sight. I couldn't tell if it was following me or waiting for me. I opened the next room. Smoke lingered thick here, almost choking, but no fire. The room was frozen mid-chaos. A bed overturned, sheets tangled. A suitcase lay open, its contents splayed as if the guest had vanished mid-motion. A mirror reflected me, but the reflection wasn't quite mine. Slightly off, the head tilted wrong, eyes wider, mouth tighter. I blinked and it snapped back. I shivered. I could feel it then, crawling under my skin. The hotel remembered everything. The smell of smoke was a memory, a scar, a warning. Each room a trap, each occupant a whisper refusing to fade. And somewhere in the building, decades of departures and absences were folding in on each other, pressing against the walls, pressing against me. I backed out of the room, trying to steady my breathing. My hand brushed the doorframe and I felt heat, a faint pulse, not a heartbeat I owned. Something alive, waiting beneath the paint, the plaster, the wood. The hall stretched again. I wanted the elevator, I needed it, but each step seemed to elongate the corridor, each shadow crawling along the walls, keeping pace with me. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, a cough. I froze, I couldn't locate it. I turned slowly. The smoke swirled in corners, forming shapes. A man's silhouette. He moved closer when I stepped back, yet remained at the periphery of my vision. I could feel him, not just see him. Decades of absence pressed against him. Every guest who had never left was here somehow, and he was part of them. I pressed forward, trying doors at random. Each held a fragment of someone else. A child's drawing on a wall, smeared in soot. A chair tilted, untouched, yet dented as though someone had just risen. The smell of smoke thickened in some rooms, faded in others, always lingering, always impossible to trace. I realized that I was walking through memories, not just rooms. Memories that weren't mine, yet pressed against me like a weight. Finally, a room appeared quiet, almost normal. The smoke was faint, barely there, curling lazily above a cold fireplace. I collapsed into a chair, relief sharp and fleeting. The ledger lay on the table. I opened it, almost afraid to see what it would show. The pages were blank. For a moment, hope flickered. I might be free. Then I noticed the margins. Names scratched in tiny, deliberate letters. One I knew, my name. Written beneath it, a date that hadn't happened yet, and a single word, return. I looked up. The smoke shifted. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, soft but deliberate. A chair scraped across the floor somewhere behind me. No one there. The whispers came again, faint, tangled in the air. You belong, you remember. I staggered to my feet, legs unsteady. The hallway outside stretched infinitely now, doors beyond doors, smoke curling into each frame. The hotel was breathing, alive in its own quiet way, every room holding fragments of lives, of departures that never happened, and every fragment remembered me. I pressed toward the elevator finally, every step heavy, every breath thick with the lingering scent. The doors were waiting, silent, patient. The hum inside promised relief, escape, or another chapter I couldn't yet understand. I hesitated, looking down the corridor one last time. A shadow moved, not in the distance but at the edge of my vision. I blinked. The hallway was empty, but the smell of smoke remained, curling around the corners, whispering across the carpet, clinging to the walls like it always would. A warning, an invitation. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and exhaled. The doors closed, slow, deliberate. The hum rose, vibration against my chest. The smell of smoke lingered faintly even inside the car, whispering, waiting, reminding me that the hotel held on to everything. Every guest, every night, every secret. And it would not let me forget. I pressed my forehead against the cool brass, listening to the soft hum. The smell of smoke wrapped around me, and somewhere in the corners of the building I could not see, a whisper carried my name. Return. I stepped outside, and the air hit me like a wall I hadn't been ready for. Dawn stretched across the sky, soft gold bleeding into pale gray, but the city wasn't the one I remembered leaving behind. Streets curved differently, signs I knew twisted in subtle ways like a memory that had been edited while I slept. My shoes pressed against wet pavement, yet no rain had fallen. The smell of smoke lingered, faint, almost polite, curling from alleys that should have been empty. I tried to take a breath, deep and steady, to tell myself I was just tired imagining things after the hotel's corridors. But the air itself seemed wrong, thick with quiet, expectant, and familiar. I could feel eyes pressing at the backs of my knees, shadows crawling along walls, turning corners before I even reached them. I pulled my coat tighter, trying to keep some distance between me and everything around me. Then I saw it on the ledge of a streetlight, a small notebook, worn, leather-bound. I knew it, though I'd never seen it before. I reached for it, and the moment my fingers touched the cover, I knew it was the guest ledger. My guest ledger. I flipped it open. My name was written on the page, clear, deliberate. Beneath it, a date that hadn't come yet. Beneath that, a room number I didn't recognize. I dropped it, stumbling back, heart hammering so hard I thought the city might hear it. How could this be? I had left. I had stepped out. The hotel doors behind me were closed, silent, normal. And yet here it was, insisting I had never truly gone. I walked. The streets were quiet but not empty. Every corner, every doorway held something just beyond perception. A flicker in the reflection of a window, a shape that ducked when I blinked. My own shadow sometimes seemed too long, stretching toward places I hadn't stepped yet. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the feeling that the city itself was waiting, holding its breath and watching me. I came to a small cafe I knew well. Closed, of course, as it was early, but the chairs outside were arranged differently. One chair pulled out from the table as if someone had just risen. On the table was another guest ledger, smaller this time. I leaned closer. My name again. Beneath it, a note scribbled in haste. "Don't leave, not yet." I looked around. The city seemed to fold in on itself. Buildings I remembered as tall were shorter. Streets curved into alleys I had never walked. And always, just at the corner of my vision, something moved, someone or something watching, waiting. I couldn't tell if it was new or if it had always been there. A bus rattled past, windows fogged, and I glimpsed faces pressed to glass. Ghostly faces, or perhaps reflections. Each one flickered, a fragment of a memory I couldn't place. And then the smell. Faint smoke curling from beneath a door at the far end of the street. I didn't want to follow it. I didn't want to go back, not after everything, but my feet carried me forward. The building it came from was familiar, yet unfamiliar. The door was half open. I could see a light flicker inside, shadows dancing across walls. I hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. Then I noticed the ledger again, sitting on a small desk just inside. My name, my handwriting, yet older. Written in a hand I recognized but could not own. I shivered, and the smell of smoke deepened, pressing into my lungs, curling around my thoughts. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath me. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting endless corridors that I did not remember, stretching infinitely. My reflection multiplied with every step, some shadows moving independently of me. And then a whisper, faint at first. "You belong." I turned. Nothing. Only mirrors, smoke curling along the edges, light flickering from an unseen source. The ledger lay open on the desk, a pen beside it. Trembling, I picked it up. Names stacked upon names, guests who had checked in and never left. Names I recognized from stories I had heard. Whispers from the hotel that had followed me here. And then my own, written in ink that glowed faintly in the dim light. I dropped the book again, heart racing. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with me. Shadows moved along the ceiling, then down the stairs that hadn't existed before. I realized, somewhere deep in me, that I had stepped into another version of the hotel. One that followed me, no matter where I ran. A door at the end of the hall opened slowly, revealing a room I didn't recognize. Inside, furniture arranged neatly as if expecting me. A chair tipped forward slightly, a cup on the nightstand still holding tea. I remembered that smell, the faint smoke curling lazily. And then I understood. The hotel had followed me outside, had folded the city itself into its corridors, dragging fragments of rooms, of lives, of memories into this morning light. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave. But every step I took seemed measured, anticipated. The city stretched around me like a trap, every alley, every street turning toward the same impossible point. And there, at the center, the ledger waited again, as if I had never left, as if leaving had never mattered. I picked it up, hands shaking. My name over and over, ink bleeding into the paper, letters curling slightly as if alive. I could feel the weight of decades pressing against me. Every guest who had never checked out was here. And now I was theirs too. Not fully, not yet, but I could feel the tether tightening, pulling me back to corridors I had walked, to rooms frozen in time, to smoke that would never clear. I dropped the book. My reflection appeared in a nearby window, and for a moment I didn't recognize myself. Eyes too wide, shadowed beneath the lids, a pale tension I had not known before. I blinked. Normal again, but the unease lingered. The city was waking now. Streetlights flickered out as dawn spread, but the smell of smoke remained, curling along sidewalks, slipping beneath doors. The hotel itself had changed, and I knew it didn't matter where I went. Somewhere behind the walls, in mirrors, in reflections, in alleys that didn't exist before, it was waiting, and it knew me. I walked, step after step, pavement beneath my feet. Every corner, every building seemed to rearrange subtly when I wasn't looking. I glanced down at a puddle and saw the reflection of a hallway instead of the street. Doors opened in the glass that weren't there in reality, and inside them, shadows curled, waiting. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my feet kept moving, pulling me forward. The ledger called, faintly, somewhere deep in the city, and I knew as the sun rose fully that the hotel had never let me go. Maybe it never would. Maybe leaving was always part of the story, part of the trap. A figure appeared in the distance, a bellboy in uniform carrying a cart. I froze. It moved toward me, then paused, head tilting, a glance that carried recognition, warning, and accusation. I tried to speak. My voice caught. The figure blurred, flickered, and vanished. I was alone, yet not. The smell of smoke trailed me now, almost sweet, curling around my arms, my legs, entering my hair. It whispered in patterns I couldn't understand, phrases I could almost catch. You belong. You remember, and my name over and over. Written in ink I could feel beneath my fingers, pulling me toward the corridors that awaited, just beyond the corners of the city, just beyond the dawn. I looked back once. The streets were empty, but the signs, the angles, the alleys, they all whispered of the hotel, of rooms I had walked, of names I had read. My own name, written in a guest ledger that had followed me into the day, haunted the margins of reality. I realized then with a sinking certainty that leaving had been an illusion. I inhaled sharply, tasted smoke on the air, and moved forward. Every street, every building, every shadow seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. Somewhere, the hotel waited. Somewhere, the rooms remembered. And somewhere, my name was already written on a page I had yet to reach. Dawn broke fully over the city, gold and gray intertwining. But I did not feel the warmth, only the smoke, only the whispers, only the weight of a place that would never release me, a place that had already recorded my presence in its endless ledger, a place that had folded itself into the world outside its doors. And I knew, before even thinking it, that I would return. I arrived after midnight, the city streets empty but for the occasional hum of a distant taxi. The hotel loomed above me, its stone facade elegant, yet aged in a way that suggested stories long forgotten or waiting. The lights inside glowed warmly, almost too warmly, casting shadows that clung to corners like silent witnesses. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing against the marble as I pushed the revolving door, and the scent of polished wood and faint smoke wrapped around me immediately. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. No other guests, no bellboys rushing. Only a soft tick of an ornate clock on the wall. I approached the front desk. A man appeared behind it, sharp in a dark suit, perfectly groomed, with eyes that seemed to measure more than just my arrival. He smiled, not warmly exactly, but with a precision that made my stomach tighten. "Welcome," he said. His voice was smooth, calm, practiced, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like memory, as if he knew who I was before I introduced myself. "We've been expecting you." I blinked, caught off guard. "Expecting me?" He nodded, a faint tilt of his head. "Yes, your preferences were noted." He slid a registration card across the desk. "Room 604. Do let us know if you require anything unusual. We are very attentive to our guests." I hesitated. There was something unsettling in his choice of words, in the way he lingered on attentive. I didn't know what I might need. I didn't even know myself yet, but I signed, trying to keep my voice steady. The pen felt heavier than normal, as if the hotel itself were pressing down, marking me, imprinting me into its history. He handed me a key, brass, ornate, warm to the touch. The number 604 engraved with meticulous care. I noticed with a flicker of unease that the metal felt slightly alive, pulsing faintly under my fingers. I shook it off, telling myself I was tired, just a long journey, a long night. The corridor leading to the elevator was lined with faded tapestries, depicting scenes I couldn't quite place. Faces twisted in frozen smiles, landscapes that didn't match reality, yet were strangely familiar. Each step I took seemed to echo differently, as if the hall itself shifted subtly, anticipating my movement, adjusting. Inside the elevator, the brass panels gleamed under soft lights. I pressed 6. The doors closed and the lift hummed, a low vibration that seemed to resonate with my chest. And then it stopped, not at 604 but at 7. The display flickered, numbers counting backward, forward, then settling. A soft chime and the doors opened. The hallway beyond was narrower, darker than the one I had entered. A faint scent of smoke lingered, though no fireplace burned. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper of conversation drifted through the air. I paused. It was impossible this floor shouldn't exist. Not in the hotel's blueprints I had seen online. And yet, here it was, waiting. I stepped forward. The carpet was plush, muffling my steps, yet the whispers grew louder, fragments of words I almost recognized. Always arrives late, never leaves entirely. Remember him. I shook my head, pressing on. Room numbers appeared on polished doors, each one slightly askew. 701, 702, 703, and at 604, the door I had come to visit, the number glowed faintly, warmer than brass, beckoning. I inserted the key and the lock clicked, heavy and deliberate. The door opened to a room perfectly arranged, neat, yet the air held a faint chill. A journal lay on the nightstand, open to a page filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, but felt familiar. Names, dates, fragments of memories I couldn't place, written in careful, looping letters. I swallowed hard, feeling the edges of unease curl inside me. The concierge's words echoed in my mind, attentive to our guests. I wondered what exactly he had meant, what had been noted, and why, when I looked around the room, did it feel as if it had been waiting for me, not just prepared for me. I set my bag down. The faint smoke curled at the edges of the ceiling, twisting into patterns that almost formed faces. Each breath I took felt measured, monitored like the room itself exhaled with me, watching me, testing me. I wanted to leave, but the thought made the walls seem to pulse, closing in, holding me gently yet firmly in place. A soft knock at the door startled me. I froze. My name whispered through the crack of the keyhole, a sound that made my stomach flip. "Mr. Alden," the voice said, faint, distant, yet precise. "We hope your stay is comfortable." I opened the door. No one was there, just the hallway stretching on, silent as if swallowing sound. But the moment I stepped closer, the shadows shifted slightly. I caught a glimpse of the concierge at the far end, standing perfectly still, hands clasped, head tilted. Then he disappeared, or had he ever been there at all? I returned to the room, heart hammering. The journal remained open, pages fluttering despite the absence of wind. I read, line by line, names of guests, some I had heard of, others I hadn't. Each entry ended the same way: did not leave. A sudden draft swept the room. Papers scattered. The smoke thickened, curling around my ankles, rising to meet me. Faces formed in it, some young, some old, some familiar, some impossibly familiar. My reflection in the window behind the desk twisted slightly. My face stared back, eyes wider, pale, shadowed beneath the lids. I stumbled back. The journal slammed shut. The pen rolled across the floor toward me, stopping at my feet. I picked it up, hands shaking. Ink glimmered faintly. My name appeared at the top of a new page, written in the same precise looped letters. I dropped it, heart racing. The hotel knew me. It had always known me. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle resisted, then gave slightly, then slipped back as if refusing. A soft, polite laugh echoed from the hallway, warm, inviting, yet hollow. My fingers gripped the key. I turned it again, listening to the sound of metal twisting. The whisper of my name carried on a breeze that should not exist. Outside the door, the hallway had changed. Shadows stretched impossibly long, corners folded into themselves, walls shifting subtly. I caught glimpses of rooms I had never seen. A figure appeared briefly, my own silhouette, standing by a desk, waiting, then dissolving into the pattern of smoke curling through the corridor. I leaned against the door. My reflection appeared in the glass panels of the window. I blinked. The reflection moved a fraction too slowly, head tilting, eyes following something behind me. A whisper brushed against my ear. "Check in, never out." I shivered. The concierge's words replayed in my mind, now heavy with meaning. Attentive, expecting, nodding. I realized I had walked in as a guest, but the hotel had been waiting for me, preparing for me, anticipating me. And somewhere deep I understood, the polite bow, the measured voice, the perfect suit, they were not human. They were the hotel, all of it. Every polished floor, every flicker of light, every shadow shaped to watch, to record, to remember. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time folded strangely here. My watch read differently each time I glanced. The journal, still open on the nightstand, now held entries that described me entering, signing in, touching the key, setting down my bag. Events I had lived only moments ago, captured precisely in ink. I felt the weight of eternity pressing on my shoulders, the gentle insistence that I was already part of the ledger, already part of the hotel. A soft tap drew my eyes to the window. Across the street, the city stretched, quiet, empty. But the hotel reflected differently, taller, wider, impossibly ancient. A shadow moved behind the glass, waving politely. I swallowed hard. I wanted to walk outside, breathe the morning air, escape. But I understood I was not meant to leave. Not yet, not truly. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing, eyes fixed on the journal. My name stared back at me, looping letters curving perfectly. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets. Inside, the hotel breathed around me, alive, knowing, patient. And I realized I had checked in, yes, but I had never left. I shouldn't have left the lobby so quickly, but something in the way the concierge had watched me, smiling too precisely, made my skin crawl. I stepped into the hallway, the carpet muffling my steps, the lights dim but steady. The smell of polished wood lingered, faintly sweet and faintly burnt, as if the hotel itself exhaled smoke it shouldn't. Then I heard it, footsteps, soft, deliberate, matching my pace but slower, heavier. I froze. The hallway was empty. No one. Just my own shadow stretching across the faded wallpaper, curling like smoke against the ceiling. I told myself it was nothing, my nerves, the echoes of a long night. But the sound persisted, keeping time with mine, just behind, just out of reach. I turned sharply, expecting a figure. Nothing. Only a door at the far end, slightly ajar. A weak sliver of light fell onto the carpet, but the room beyond was dark. The faint smell of smoke drifted from it, like someone had been there recently. My stomach knotted. The door creaked again, slow and deliberate, like it had a pulse of its own. Curiosity and fear fought inside me. I stepped forward. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, stretching impossibly, walls narrowing just enough to make me feel small. The floorboards whispered under my weight, and I noticed the wallpaper peeling in odd places, curling inwards as if recoiling from something unseen. I reached the door. A suitcase lay on the floor, its handle worn and the leather cracked. A coat hung on a chair, stiff as if waiting, nothing else. No person, no sign of life. But the air was cold and I felt watched. My hand hovered over the suitcase. The leather was warm, too warm, like someone had just set it down. I pulled my hand back and stumbled slightly, heart hammering. The footsteps returned. Behind me, I spun around again. Empty hallway, only the faint echo of my own breathing. The lights flickered. One bulb overhead dimmed, then brightened. Shadows shifted along the walls, folding over themselves. Something moved just at the corner of my eye, and when I looked directly, nothing was there. I pressed on toward the next door. The hallway stretched further than it should have. Rooms opened into rooms, each identical yet subtly different. A chair here, a suitcase there, a scarf draped over a bed. Every item abandoned, every space frozen like snapshots of life left mid-motion. I began to notice details. A half-finished cup of tea, a book open face down, a hat on a dresser, dust settling slowly over everything. It was as if time itself paused inside these rooms. And yet the footsteps never left. They followed, patient, echoing. Sometimes quick, sometimes slow, never more than a few steps behind. I called out, voice low, but it didn't matter. The sound swallowed itself in the corridor, leaving only the heavy, unbroken presence. I reached another door, its number faded. I pushed it open. Inside, the room was neat but lived in. A jacket thrown across the bed, shoes by the nightstand. A wallet open, papers spilling slightly as if the owner had been interrupted. I picked up a card. The name was familiar, too familiar. Not mine, but it made my chest tighten. Something whispered soft behind me. Not words, not fully formed, just a breath of sound. "You shouldn't be here," I spun. Empty hallway. The lights flickered again. Shadows stretched along the walls like thin fingers. My breath caught. I wanted to leave, to run back to the lobby, but the hallway seemed endless, folding in on itself, stretching just enough to make retreat impossible. I stepped forward again. Another door creaked. Another room, more belongings, a suitcase half-packed, clothes spilling onto the floor, a letter on the dresser. I picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. My fingers trembled. The letter described someone arriving, signing in, setting down a bag exactly as I had. The words twisted in my mind. How could this be? I had only just arrived. The footsteps grew louder, closer, slower, faster. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew they weren't human. I tried to call out again, but my voice felt trapped in my throat, muffled by the walls, by the air itself. The shadows deepened, thickening around the corners of my vision. I wanted to look away, but something drew me forward, compelled me to see, to understand. Another door opened on its own. Inside, a chair faced the wall, a coat draped across it. On the floor, shoes polished, neat, waiting. I bent down to pick them up, to make sense of it. The moment I touched them, the room shivered, the walls humming faintly, vibrating with a sound that was almost a voice. I pulled back, heart hammering, sweat prickling my skin. The corridor behind me shifted, or had I moved? I wasn't sure. The walls narrowed again, the ceiling dipping just slightly. Shadows pooled in corners. I caught movement, something flickering between rooms, barely visible, a reflection, a figure. My name whispered along the air. Alden. I ran cautiously, trying not to make noise, trying not to provoke whatever followed. Rooms opened and closed in rhythm with my steps. I glanced at the walls, scratches, faded photographs, forgotten postcards, items left behind for decades. Every object seemed aware of me, cataloging me, marking me, nodding my presence. The footsteps mirrored mine perfectly. Not once did they falter, not once did they leave. My reflection caught in a small mirror hanging at the end of the hall. My face stared back, pale, eyes wide. But then my reflection blinked differently. A slow, deliberate movement, one beat behind mine. My stomach turned. I looked away and the mirror fogged slightly, leaving only a hint of movement beneath the surface. I found myself at another door, no number. I pushed it open. The room was empty, but the air smelled of smoke again, faint, curling in the corners. The floor was sticky, coated in dust. A chair tipped over. A suitcase lay open, clothes spilling onto the carpet. And on the dresser, a guest ledger. I opened it. Names, dates, entries, some recent, some decades old. And here, written in precise letters, my name. I froze. My fingers hovered over the page. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, thick, almost unbearable. Then softly, a whisper. You belong here now. I spun, expecting someone, something to appear. Empty hallway. Only shadows, only the scent of smoke and dust. My heart pounded. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with my pulse. I realized then that the hotel had been waiting for me. Every echo, every abandoned room, every object left mid-use. It had all been anticipating my arrival. I turned back to the ledger. My name repeated page after page. I didn't remember signing in beyond the lobby, yet here it was, written carefully, logged meticulously. Each entry hinted at presence, at continuation. The hotel had no intention of letting me leave. Not fully, not ever. Footsteps resumed behind me, softer now, patient again. I stepped forward, leaving the ledger. Rooms shifted slightly as I passed, layouts changing subtly. Doors that had been closed now slightly ajar, some previously open now sealed. The hallway was alive, bending reality, marking me, holding me in its rhythm. I kept moving, slower this time, studying the abandoned belongings. Each item whispered a story. A coat here, a suitcase there, a hat, a letter, a photograph. All fragments of lives once lived within these walls. And now mine. My presence added another layer, another echo, another story that would never truly leave. The hallway stretched endlessly, each door another fragment, another presence. And behind me, those footsteps, soft, deliberate, exacting. They weren't trying to scare me. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were following, cataloging, confirming. The hotel needed me to be aware, needed me to see, needed me to exist within its quiet, endless order. I stopped at a door marked 612. Nothing unusual except for the faint glow from inside. I opened it, empty. The air thick with the faint smell of smoke. A chair in the corner, a suitcase on the floor, and a note. I picked it up. It read only, "You have arrived. Do not leave." I dropped the note. Footsteps behind me again, echoing softly. The hallway stretched further. I realized then fully the truth. I had wandered into something older than the building itself. A network of echoes, of forgotten lives, of visitors who never left, never really left. And now I was cataloged, logged. A guest who would never truly check out. I found the stack tucked behind a loose panel in the wall of the lobby. The wood smelled faintly of smoke, dust clinging like it hadn't been disturbed for decades. I pulled out the papers, yellowed, edges frayed. My fingers trembled. The top letter was folded carefully as though waiting for someone. The handwriting was elegant, looping, each word deliberate. I read the first line and froze. The smiling concierge knows. He always knows. I laughed quietly, but it felt hollow. The lobby had seemed normal, quiet, the air thick with polished wood and faint smoke. Yet the memory of the concierge's eyes, too sharp, too knowing, pressed against my mind. I flipped to the next letter. He predicted my fall before it happened. I thought it was coincidence. I was wrong. My stomach tightened. The letters were a chain of warnings, each describing a guest's encounter with him, each ending with misfortune. A man's lost job, a woman's sudden illness, a child who vanished and was never found. The stories blurred, repeating certain phrases almost like a refrain. He smiles and you forget yourself. You follow without knowing why. I put the papers down, heart hammering. I should have left them there untouched, but curiosity pushed me forward. I picked another letter at random, a date decades old, a name eerily familiar. The details were precise. Someone arriving late at night, signing in, leaving belongings in the room. Someone very much like me. A faint whisper came from behind the reception desk. I spun. No one. The lobby stretched longer than I remembered, corners shadowed, the carpet darker in the dim light. I told myself it was the building settling, a draft, nothing more. Yet the whispers persisted, soft, like paper brushing against wood. You shouldn't be here. I returned to the letters. Some had notes in the margins, scrawled, almost frantic. Don't trust the smile, it waits for your misstep. Another simply read, he always knows. I ran a finger down the page. My own name seemed to hover on the edges of the margins, almost invisible, ink slightly faded. I blinked. It had not been there before. The smell of smoke grew stronger. Not burning wood, not fire, but something lingering, intangible, curling in the corners of the room. The shadows in the lobby deepened, thickening along the walls. I shivered. The concierge's image flitted behind my mind's eye, smiling, patient, knowing. His presence seemed to seep from the letters themselves. I gathered the letters, flipping through rapidly. Each one described encounters that matched my own strange impressions of the hotel. Small details, footsteps echoing where no one walked, doors that shifted locations, fleeting reflections in mirrors that weren't mine. Each story ended with the same sense of unease. The guest trapped in something beyond comprehension, aware yet powerless. I felt my pulse rising. The letters were alive with memory, or something like memory. They weren't just recounting events, they were demanding attention. A pattern emerged. Each guest had arrived alone, always at night, always noticing the smile first, always followed by a sense that the hotel itself had taken notice. A door creaked. My head snapped toward it, empty hallway. Footsteps echoed faintly, delayed as if mocking me. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe. The letters crinkled in my hands. One slipped from the stack, landing open at a page with a sketch of the concierge. I stared at it. He smiled, mouth curling perfectly, eyes hollow. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to put the letters back, but the lobby seemed to stretch, the walls bending slightly, edges blurring. The shadows pooled. Each scrawl, each marginal note pressed itself against my mind, whispering half-formed warnings. My reflection appeared in the brass frame of the reception desk, but there was something off. My eyes wider than usual, tense, and behind them, a shadow that didn't match my movements. The whispering grew louder, almost insistent. I forced myself to read another letter. The margins now held longer sentences. He waits for your step, your glance, your hesitation. He watches you even when you think you are alone. My stomach churned. Each note threaded into the next, a chain linking past and present. The hotel wasn't empty. It was aware, patient, observing through generations. I backed toward the exit. The doors seemed farther than before, the hallway stretching subtly. A faint rustle brushed my ear. I spun. Empty. Only the scent of smoke remained, curling in thin tendrils along the carpet. I tried to steady myself. Each letter in my hands now seemed heavier, pressing down as though alive, marking me, cataloging me. A letter fell from the top of the stack, landing at my feet. The handwriting was shaky, frantic. He smiles for you. You will follow. You always follow. Do not resist. My pulse spiked. I looked around, half expecting the concierge to step out from behind the desk. Nothing. Yet I felt him in the air, in the silence, in the faint curling smoke. I picked up the letter and read it aloud, softly, voice trembling. If you read this, you are next. The lobby shifted. A carpet seam rippled. The shadow at the desk stretched just slightly, curling at the edges. My hands shook. I realized that the letters weren't merely warnings, they were invitations, or traps, perhaps both. The whispering coalesced, forming almost words. You will arrive, you will sign, you will belong. I swallowed hard. My eyes darted across the lobby. Every mirror reflected the same tense image, me, alone, yet watched. Each reflective surface seemed slightly off, subtle differences I couldn't place at first glance. Eyes wider, mouth tighter, shadows moving differently. I tried to leave. The exit door felt heavier, the handle colder than memory, metal slick under my fingers. As I pulled, the lobby seemed to expand further back, the carpet stretching. The letters in my hands rustled. One slipped to the floor. I looked down. The note had rewritten itself. My name now written in the margins, small, precise, unavoidable. I froze. A wave of realization struck. The hotel was folding me into its memory just as it had with others. Each letter was a fragment of lives already absorbed, already cataloged. I felt my mind tighten around the thought. I had become part of something larger, something patient, something endless. The whispers rose again, clearer, sharper. He always knows, you follow, you are next. I staggered back. The brass elevator doors at the end of the hall shimmered faintly, though I had no recollection of their presence before. Something pulled me toward them. I resisted. The letters pressed against my chest, almost suffocating, their weight growing. I glanced again at the sketch of the concierge. His eyes seemed to move, following me, confirming that my realization was correct. This place did not merely house guests. It absorbed them, mapped them, recorded them. I was being drawn into that system, into the pattern, into the endless chain described in the letters. I shoved the stack of papers back toward the loose wall panel, as if returning them could undo the inevitability. The whispering softened for a heartbeat, almost relieved, then returned, insistent. You will read again, you cannot leave. My hands shook. I backed toward the exit once more. The hallway twisted, edges dim, shadows pooling. Each door I passed opened briefly to reveal past guests, frozen in time, staring, waiting. I looked down at the letters again. One note lay open. The smiling concierge predicts your misfortune. It begins now. My breath hitched. I could feel it, some unseen pull guiding me toward repetition, toward signing in, toward being cataloged, noted, observed. The lobby had already marked me, recorded me, written my name in its margins. I tried to tear my gaze away, but the shadows, the smoke, the whispering, the letters, they all tugged at me. My own reflection stared back, tense, anxious, aware. And in the margins of the letters, my name glimmered faintly, confirming the truth. I was next in line, drawn into a chain I had only glimpsed, never thought I would join. The lobby felt endless. Every corner I turned revealed the same arrangement: a desk, a shadow, a whispering, the curl of smoke. Each letter in the stack seemed to pulse, alive with the memory of the past and the inevitability of my arrival. I understood fully that the smiling concierge's warnings weren't optional. They were guarantees. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to shake it off. When I opened them, the lobby remained the same, yet subtly altered. The papers in my hands rustled as if impatient. The whispering continued, patient, eternal. And somewhere just behind the edge of hearing, I thought I could make out the concierge's faint, precise chuckle, confirming what the letters had told me all along. I didn't move, I couldn't move. I was both observer and participant now. The letters were notes in the margins of my life, marking every hesitation, every step, every glance. The hotel had recorded me, cataloged me, and as I stared at the lobby, dimly lit, smoke curling in the corners, shadows pooling at the edges, I knew that nothing outside these walls could untangle me. I reached the lobby one last time, luggage in hand, heart heavy but hopeful. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, gilding the dust motes that hung in the air like tiny ghosts. The lobby felt alive in a new way, softer somehow, but still unfamiliar. Something had changed while I slept, while I wandered. I told myself it was just the light, playing tricks on tired eyes. The concierge stood behind the desk, as always, immaculately dressed, hands folded. His smile was the same, but the warmth it should have carried was absent. I felt it immediately, the chill beneath the polished veneer. My throat tightened and I kept my gaze low, pretending to check my watch. The mirror above the reception desk caught my attention. I almost didn't want to look, but the pull was irresistible. I saw my reflection, pale from restless nights, hair mussed from uneasy sleep, eyes wide. And behind me, he was there. The concierge's reflection. But the reflection didn't match the lobby I was in. The walls and the glass were darker, the shadows longer. The corners seemed to stretch and pulse slightly, as if breathing. I spun, empty. The lobby was as it always had been. Polished marble floors gleaming under the sun, chairs neatly arranged, no trace of the warped reflection. My stomach sank. I turned back to the mirror. He remained, smiling, eyes sharp and knowing. Not behind the desk in reality, but behind me in the glass, watching. I swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. Step outside, feel the fresh air, escape the suffocating elegance of the hotel. I tried. I stepped forward. My reflection mirrored me perfectly, except him. Every time I blinked, he shifted, a subtle twitch of his head, leaning slightly closer than he should have. I felt the weight of unseen eyes on my back, like icy fingers brushing along my spine. I moved faster, luggage rattling over the floor, echoing off the high ceilings. The concierge didn't move. He didn't speak. But the smile remained, growing almost imperceptibly wider, colder, sharper. My own reflection began to feel wrong. My shoulders were tense, my expression taut, and behind me in the mirror, his eyes followed me relentlessly, impossibly. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The lobby remained quiet, almost too quiet. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight, but the stillness pressed against my eardrums, filling every small space with anticipation. The air smelled faintly of smoke, faintly familiar, and it made my chest tight. I had felt it before, in letters, in whispers, in the stretching shadows of this place. I reached the door. My hand hovered over the brass handle. Cold, too cold. My reflection mirrored the motion, but behind me the concierge's image lingered, grinning just slightly more. I wanted to tear my eyes from the glass, to force myself out, but I couldn't. Some part of me, the part that had read the letters, that had walked the hallways at night, that had felt the echoing footsteps, wanted to see what would happen if I didn't look away. I opened the door. Light flooded in. The city greeted me with its usual chaos, street sounds, car horns, distant voices. I felt relief, real relief. For a heartbeat, I imagined myself leaving. Leaving the lobby, leaving the hotel, leaving him, leaving the letters, leaving all the whispers behind. But the mirror waited, and in it he waited too. His eyes followed me through the threshold. Every step forward I took, he mirrored, always precise, always patient. I felt my chest tighten, heart hammering against ribs that no longer felt like my own. Was he real? Had he ever been real? Or was he something born from the lobby itself, a memory made flesh, a reflection of the countless who had arrived, noticed, and stayed? I walked faster, the street beneath my feet rough and uneven, sun warm on my skin, but my mind replayed the lobby. Shadows curling at edges, whispers I could almost hear again, letters murmuring in my memory. I had thought I was leaving, but leaving felt like stepping into another kind of trap, one built outside where the world itself might bend, just enough to keep me within its reach. A bus rolled past, honking. People moved around me unaware. I tried to draw comfort from their oblivion, but the memory of the mirror persisted. His smile, his patient, knowing smile. The lobby hadn't let me go. I had stepped outside, yes, but outside now carried the weight of the hotel, the watchful eyes, the inevitability written in the margins of letters and reflections. I stopped at a corner, tugging at my suitcase. I glanced back once, and the hotel loomed at the end of the street. Sunlight touched its facade, but the shadows behind the windows seemed deeper, more deliberate. Something was waiting, or perhaps it was already moving. The mirror had told me as much. The concierge's smile remained, reflected somewhere I could not yet see. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just memory, just anxiety, the way one hall can stretch in dreams. But the air still smelled faintly of smoke, just enough to curl in my nostrils, just enough to make my skin prickle. My footsteps on the pavement sounded unnaturally loud, and I swore, just for a second, that the faintest echo of a chuckle followed me down the street. I hailed a taxi, doors slamming, engine humming. The city moved on, oblivious to my tension, oblivious to the lobby stretching, whispering, bending reality just slightly. I tried to watch the street, focus on lights, on signs, on anything tangible. But all I could see in my mind was the mirror, and in it him, always smiling, always patient, always aware. The cab moved, tires crunching over asphalt. I counted each passing block. Each street corner stretched just slightly, reminding me that the world outside might not be as fixed as I hoped. I tried to tell myself it was fear talking, imagination. But imagination could not explain the letters, the hallways, the smoke, the whispers. It could not explain the certainty that he knew, that he always knew. I glanced at my reflection in the cab window. I had grown pale again, eyes wide, lips tight. And behind me, in that thin layer of glass separating inside from street, I thought I saw a familiar curve of a smile just for a heartbeat. I blinked. Nothing. Only the street, only neon signs, only city life moving on. But my heart told me differently. I had not left. Not really. The concierge's reflection had taught me something. Presence is not always physical. Awareness does not always require walls. And in the quiet, in the thin veil between reflection and reality, I realized the hotel would not let me go. Not entirely. Not ever. I carried it with me now, in the scent of smoke, in the curl of shadows, in the echo of that endless, patient smile. I arrived at my apartment, keys shaking in my hand. Door closed. Lights switched on. The normal hum of the city reached me here too. Safe, perhaps. But when I looked at the small mirror in the hallway, I froze. A faint, familiar curve of lips hovered at the edge of the glass, too precise, too patient. My own eyes widened, heart racing. And for a long moment I thought the room itself had bent just slightly, letting him follow. I tried to breathe, deeply, slowly. The hotel was behind me, yes, in distance. But it was also within me now, etched into memory, into awareness, into the subtle terror that anything I saw could be mirrored by him, watched by him. Each reflection, each shadow, each scent of smoke could bring the lobby back, folded into the present. I sat down, luggage set aside, tried to focus on work, on mundane tasks, on anything to anchor myself. But the quiet moments stretched thin. My own reflection startled me in a darkened window. For a second his eyes gleamed from the glass, watching, patient, certain. I realized that leaving had been an illusion. Departure was possible. Escape was not. Time passed, or I thought it did. Every reflective surface whispered his presence. My apartment, familiar and safe, felt slightly off, subtly altered. Every mirror, every polished tabletop, every window became a reminder: he waits, he watches. Not just in the lobby, not just in the hotel, but wherever I am. Always patient, smiling, knowing. I lay down eventually, trying to rest, trying to convince myself that the city, the street, the apartment could not hold him. But in the quiet, just before sleep, I caught the faintest curl of smoke in the corner of the room. A memory, a scent, a presence, reminding me that departure is never complete. That some places, some people, some reflections follow you far beyond their walls. And when I closed my eyes, I knew he was there. Not in body, not in hand, but in the margins of perception, in the spaces I did not want to see, in the subtle, patient knowledge that I had never truly left. The hallway smelled of decay before I even saw it. Dust thickened the air, making each breath taste like old paper and metal. My flashlight cut a thin path through the shadows, its beam trembling as my hands did. The wing was abandoned, or so I thought, but it carried a weight, like it had been waiting for someone. Me, maybe. Wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing the yellowed plaster beneath. At first I thought it was just old age, but then I saw them, strange markings etched into the wall, almost hidden in the layers beneath. Lines and shapes that didn't make sense. Circles inside triangles. Letters maybe, or numbers, dates. 1923, 1947, 1969. The years were almost too precise, like someone had been keeping track of time in secret. I crouched closer, tracing a finger along the faded ink. The plaster crumbled under my touch. I could feel the ridges of what someone had pressed in with care or desperation. Scribbles ran in chaotic patterns, some crossed out, some looping into symbols I didn't recognize. My stomach twisted. What kind of people had lived here? What had they been trying to say? The silence was deep, unnatural. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and echoing. A floorboard creaked behind me and I jerked my head toward it. Nothing. Just shadows stretching toward the ceiling, moving with a life of their own. I told myself it was the wind, the building settling, but instinct refused the explanation. I moved down the hall, flashlight sweeping over broken furniture. Chairs toppled, a long-forgotten coat hanging limp over a doorknob. Dust covered everything, but something about the room at the inn drew me in. The wallpaper there was worse, torn in wide swaths. Beneath the plaster, the symbols multiplied. Scribbles and lines covered every inch, overlapping dates and letters. 1935, 1952, 1981. My fingers brushed them lightly, and I shivered at the thought of the hands that had carved this, years before me. Hands that now belonged only to memory. The air shifted, faint and acrid like smoke from a fire long dead. I sniffed, trying to place it. It wasn't fire exactly. More like something burned and lingered. Not the smell of wood or paint, but of something personal, something carried into walls and paper. It made me dizzy. My stomach rolled. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet kept moving, drawn forward by a curiosity I didn't trust. I noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked behind a loose strip of wallpaper. Heart pounding, I pulled it free. The handwriting was cramped, hurried. Words I could barely read. They watch, they record. 7 p.m., do not sleep. My hands shook. Who had written this? Who was watching? And why was I suddenly part of it? A low creak sounded again, closer this time. My flashlight flickered, and for a second the hall seemed longer, darker. I blinked, and it returned to normal, but my heart didn't. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things, that the abandoned wing was just old wood and peeling paper. But the scribbles didn't lie. They were proof someone or something had been here, had left warnings, had left markers. I moved to the next room. Wallpaper hung like torn curtains, curling in shapes that almost seemed intentional, almost like hands reaching. more symbols pressed into the plaster. I ran my fingers along one, tracing the lines. Dates, letters, shapes repeated. 1912, 1940, 1975. I noticed a pattern emerging, though I couldn't understand it fully. They formed rows, grids, almost like someone had been mapping something. Mapping what? And why was it here, hidden under layers of wallpaper? I took a step back. The floor groaned under me, and I realized the sound echoed oddly. Not like wood, not natural. I stopped, held my breath. Then I noticed it, faint scratches on the floor, almost like footprints, leading toward a corner where the wallpaper had almost completely fallen away. I crouched, flashlight close. Symbols continued there, but now the wall itself seemed distorted. The plaster rippled slightly, like it wasn't solid, like it wanted to bend. My hands trembled. A draft brushed my neck. The smell of smoke was stronger here, tangy, almost sweet. I glanced around. Nothing moved. But the corner of my eye caught it, a shadow flickering, impossible, a shape that didn't belong. I spun my flashlight. Empty. The wall stared back, cracked, peeling, insistent. My breathing became shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity kept dragging me forward, toward the corner, toward whatever had left these marks. I pressed my hand against the wall. Cold, smooth, too smooth. And then faintly I felt it. The impression of fingers, almost invisible, pressed into the plaster behind the wallpaper. Someone had been here, marking, tracking, leaving messages for eyes that would come decades later. I swallowed hard, feeling panic rise. What had they seen? Who were they? And why did I feel like I was following their trail rather than exploring freely? My flashlight flickered again. The hall stretched. The doorway at the end seemed farther away, darker, shadowed in a way that made the peeling wallpaper writhe. I could almost see movement in the symbols, the scribbles twitching like they were alive, pulsing under the layers. I blinked and it stilled, but the unease remained, crawling along my spine into my bones. I noticed a set of dates grouped together, almost like a timeline. 1930, 1958, 1983. My fingers brushed the plaster and I traced the line forward. Another date appeared, 2023. My pulse quickened. That was this year. Now, why was this here? Was it a warning or a record? A noise behind me. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible. My heart leaped. I spun, flashlight swinging. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. Dust floated lazily in the beam, catching the light. But my mind refused to calm. Every shadow felt heavier now. Every corner seemed to hold a secret. The scribbles weren't just marks. They were watching, waiting, echoing from decades past into this moment. I backed up slowly, trying to take in the entire wall. Peeling strips revealed layers upon layers of messages, dates, warnings, scribbles overlapping. I realized then that the wing was alive with memory, with intention. Not just abandoned. It was curated, marked, haunted not by ghosts, but by traces of those who had left fragments of themselves behind, desperately, like breadcrumbs for anyone who dared enter. The air grew colder, the smell of smoke stronger. I shivered, feeling exposed, vulnerable. I wanted to run, but my flashlight shook in my hands. Another scrap of paper pressed between the plaster caught my eye. I pulled it free. More words, more frantic handwriting. Do not go beyond. They wait in the corners. They never forget. My stomach lurched. Who waited? And what did they never forget? I realized I had been holding my breath. The silence pressed down like a weight. Every creak, every whisper of air felt magnified. The hall was no longer just abandoned. It was aware, watching me, marking me, following me. I moved toward the stairwell, thinking escape, thinking fresh air, anything beyond this corridor of peeling wallpaper and cryptic messages. But the further I walked, the stronger the feeling of presence grew, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. The scribbles were not just symbols, they were warnings, predictions, observations. A gust of air carried dust and the faint smell of smoke directly into my face. I coughed, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief darkness I thought I saw a figure, just for a second, standing at the far end of the hall. No features, only a shape framed by shadows. I blinked. Gone, but the fear lingered. The hallways had eyes, and I was in them now. I reached the stairwell. Metal railing cold, rusted. My hand lingered on it. Downstairs, the lobby might be empty, might be normal. But something had followed me here, imprinted in the walls, in the plaster, in the dates that lined the corridor. Something waited, patient, ancient in its awareness. I could feel it, whispering, urging me to notice, to remember. I took a deep breath, forced myself forward. One step, another, the metal railing cold and unforgiving beneath my fingers. The scribbles receded behind me, but not completely. In the corner of my mind, in the edges of the hall, I knew they were still there, layered under wallpaper, layered in time, waiting for the next visitor who thought they could just explore, just leave. I glanced back once more into the dark hallway. The symbols stared. The dates glared at me. The faint curl of smoke lingered in the air. And I realized something terrifying. This wing, this corridor was patient. It kept its secrets. It marked its visitors, and it remembered everything. I didn't know if I would return. I didn't know if anyone ever truly left this wing once they saw the markings, the symbols, the timelines etched into plaster and paper. But one thing was certain. The hotel, this abandoned wing, had its way of speaking, and I had heard it. The hallway smelled like old paper and polished wood, but under it there was something sharper, something metallic, almost coppery, like blood dried too long. My footsteps echoed against the walls, but after a while I realized they weren't alone. Another set of steps followed mine, lighter, hesitant, but unmistakable. I stopped. The echo lingered. I froze. Silence. I forced a laugh, trying to tell myself it was the old building settling, the floorboards shifting after decades. But the echo persisted, just behind me. Always behind, never beside. I started walking again, faster this time, eyes scanning the dim corridor. The wallpaper peeled in long strips here too, revealing more symbols carved into the plaster. Someone had left messages all over this place. Hundreds of years of secrets stacked like layers of dust. I passed a small table against the wall and my flashlight caught something. A photograph, faded nearly to gray, lying face up in a frame cracked along the edges. I picked it up. Faces stared back. Blank eyes. Mouth slightly open, expressions frozen mid-breath. Not smiling, not frowning, just waiting. My stomach twisted. I recognized the feeling. That stillness, that impossible patience. The hallway stretched further than it should have. I blinked. The photograph slipped from my hands as if it wanted to fall, hitting the floor with a soft thud. I glanced at it again. The eyes seemed older, deeper. I shook my head. It had to be my imagination. But then I noticed something chilling. In the background of the photo, another corridor stretched into darkness, matching the one I was walking. A mirror of this hall. I swallowed hard. Whispers, soft, indistinct. At first I thought it was the wind. I thought it was the building talking to itself. But the words formed as I listened, tiny syllables, impossible to understand fully, repeating over and over. A quiet chant, low and patient, following me, surrounding me. I wanted to run, but my feet refused. Curiosity pulled harder than fear. The walls were lined with more photographs. Couples, families, children, some laughing, some solemn, but all with the same empty stare. The eyes seemed to move as I passed, tracking me, impatient for something. My pulse thumped in my ears. I wanted to touch them to confirm they were just paper. When I did, my fingers brushed the surface and I felt cold. Not the chill of the hall, but something beneath, something waiting. I stepped back, nearly tripping over a chair, and my flashlight fell on a new set of marks. Scratches on the floor, shallow, leading into the next room. I followed, every step stirring the dust into tiny whirlwinds. The air grew heavier, thicker, almost breathing with me. And the whispers grew louder, though no mouth moved. I realized then that the hall was not empty. Not really. In the next room, the photographs covered an entire wall. I counted them quickly, dozens, maybe hundreds, faces with the same blank stare. And then I saw one that made me freeze. A man standing near a window, posture rigid, eyes wide and unblinking. Something about him was familiar. I leaned closer. The longer I looked, the more I felt a shiver of recognition. The photograph's subject moved slightly in my mind. My pulse jumped. The figure seemed to tilt its head, just a fraction, as if acknowledging me. I stumbled backward, the whispering intensified. not in my ears but in my chest, vibrating through me. The room seemed to shrink, the walls bending slightly inward. And then I noticed it, faint footprints in the dust leading around the walls, not across the floor, circling, waiting, following. I tried to tell myself it was just a quirk of the abandoned building, but the footprints weren't random. They formed a path, deliberate, almost ritualistic. I stepped into the next hall. The echo returned, louder, layered, footsteps everywhere, but I saw nothing. My flashlight beam trembled. The walls now held scribbles, faint but deliberate, almost like shorthand. Symbols I didn't understand, dates, tiny notes scribbled in the margins. Do not look, they remember. My stomach clenched. Who were they, and why did they care that I looked? I moved forward, trying to keep my breathing steady. Another photograph caught my light. A woman sitting at a small desk, her eyes wide and unblinking. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, a faint shadow crouched just behind her. I swallowed hard. The shadow didn't belong in the photograph. I looked away, telling myself it was a trick of the aging print. But when I looked back, it had moved. Not in the photo, in my mind. A door creaked open across the hall. I spun my flashlight toward it. Empty room. A faint chill drifted out, smelling like smoke and iron. I stepped inside cautiously. The floorboards groaned under my weight. In the center of the room, a pile of letters sat on a desk, yellowed and brittle. I picked one up. Handwriting scrawled, hurried. They will follow, they see what you cannot. My hand trembled. I felt watched, every muscle tensing. The whispering intensified. Not in my ears, but in my chest, pressing against me. I moved from room to room, each one heavier than the last. Photographs stared. Symbols crawled under the wallpaper. The whispers grew persistent, sometimes nearly forming words. Names maybe, or warnings, or threats, I didn't know. And then I saw it, a photograph of me. Not taken, not placed by anyone I knew, but there I was, standing in the hall, eyes blank, waiting. My chest tight. That was impossible. I stumbled back into the hall. Footsteps now echoing not just behind me, but all around. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift as I passed. A couple in one frame, once side by side, now appeared slightly apart. Shadows moved beneath the edges. I could almost hear breathing from the frames themselves. My flashlight flickered. The hall stretched endlessly. The whispers became louder, overlapping, forming a chorus. They weren't trying to communicate. They were watching, counting, memorizing. A new detail struck me. A small notebook wedged between the baseboard and the wall. I pulled it free. Pages filled with writing, dates and notes, sketches of symbols, tiny diagrams of rooms, hallways, stairs. Names repeated, crossed out, rewritten. The words made no linear sense, but a pattern emerged. Someone had been documenting guests, maybe even predicting their movements. My movements. They had followed me in writing long before I walked these halls. The chill deepened, smoke-tinged air curling around me. I realized the wing was alive with memory, with record, not haunted in the traditional sense, but aware, patient, calculating, recording each step, each glance, each breath. The photographs, the notes, the scribbles, they weren't just decoration. They were an archive of observation, and now I was part of it. I tried to leave, but the hallway shifted subtly. Not physically, at least not entirely, but perceptually. Distances stretched, shadows thickened. I could feel the presence behind the photographs, moving with me, circling, waiting. The whispering became urgent, overlapping, overlapping, overlapping. My pulse raced. My hands shook. I wanted to run, but my feet stayed planted, hypnotized by the weight of so many blank eyes staring. I reached the stairwell, hopping to escape to the lobby, to sunlight, to life. The photographs leaned toward me, almost imperceptibly, eyes following, faces pressing forward in dust and paper. A voice, clear now, sharp in my mind. You cannot leave what waits. I stumbled down the stairs, each step echoing. The whispers receded slightly, replaced by an oppressive silence. But I knew it wasn't gone. The wing had remembered me. The photographs had remembered me. And as I reached the lobby, I realized the terrifying truth. Even if I left this place physically, part of me would stay, waiting, recorded, archived, eyes blank, staring, waiting for the next visitor to arrive. I glanced back once, toward the hall, toward the walls lined with faces. Shadows twisted faintly in my peripheral vision, fleeting, impossible. I felt a shiver of helplessness. This place didn't just keep its past, it kept its visitors. And now it had me, somewhere between memory and reality, a ghost in the archive of its patience. The hallway ended abruptly at a door I hadn't noticed before, set deeper into the shadows where the peeling wallpaper turned gray and brittle. I approached it slowly, running a hand across the cold wood. The lock was old, rusted, but something about it felt alive. When I pressed my palm against the surface, a shiver shot up my arm. The air coming from beneath the door wasn't just cold. It exhaled, slowly, like the room itself was breathing. I stepped back instinctively, heart thudding. The corridor behind me seemed to stretch further, darker than it had a moment ago. Shadows pooled along the walls, separate from any light source. They moved independently, curling, retreating, advancing, as if aware I was watching. A low hum vibrated through the floor. I couldn't tell if it was the building or something deeper. My curiosity clawed at me, though fear whispered not to touch the door. I leaned closer again. The exhaled air fogged the lens of my flashlight. A faint scent accompanied it, like wet earth mixed with smoke, decaying wood, and something metallic. It made my stomach twist. I traced the edge of the doorframe. The wood was smooth, but under my fingers it throbbed subtly, like a heartbeat. I swallowed. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, yet I could feel the pulse under my hand. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, soft, hesitant, but not my own. I spun around, flashlight scanning the hallway, but the corridor was empty. The shadows shifted again, forming shapes that weren't quite human but not entirely abstract either. My chest tightened. I realized then that the room wasn't simply locked, it was resisting, holding itself in, protecting whatever waited inside. I crouched slightly to look under the door. A blackness deeper than night stretched back, rolling slowly like smoke. The cold rolled out in waves, brushing my ankles, creeping up my legs. I wanted to back away, to leave, but my feet were rooted. I couldn't look away. There was something there, waiting, breathing, aware of me. The handle rattled faintly, though no one touched it. The sound made my teeth clench. The shadows near the door deepened, forming shapes that almost resembled faces, twisting in slow, imperceptible movements. A chill ran through me. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, though nothing should have been there. The air inside the room pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Faster, slower, irregular, alive. I pressed my ear against the wood. The room exhaled again, hot and cold at once. I could hear whispers now, soft, fragmented words I couldn't parse. Then I thought I heard my own name, whispered faintly, echoing, bending the air. I staggered back, flashlight wobbling. The hallway behind me felt farther than it had a moment ago, stretching endlessly, lit by a pale light that seemed to come from nowhere. I studied the lock. Rusted, old, unyielding, yet I could sense its presence beyond metal and wood. It didn't just keep people out. It kept something in. Something that didn't want to be disturbed but knew I was here. My hands trembled as I considered breaking it. Part of me wanted to flee, but a harder, darker part, the part that always sought what should remain hidden, urged me forward. The shadows moved again. One detached from the wall, slithering like smoke, and drifted toward me. I froze. Its edges were undefined, flickering with faint hints of faces, eyes, mouths, fleeting expressions. But I couldn't focus. It paused a step from my flashlight beam, hovering just out of reach. I felt a pulse of pressure in my chest, subtle but insistent, like the room itself was aware I noticed it. I stepped closer to the door, heartbeat hammering. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coherent, just fragments. Wait, don't, look. They see. The words weren't spoken. They were pressed into my mind. The shadows recoiled, then surged, twisting faster around the doorframe as though responding to my presence. I tried to force a rational thought. It's just a room, old, abandoned. Rust, drafts, peeling wallpaper. But every instinct told me this was wrong. Not just wrong, alive. I pressed my hand against the doorknob. The moment I touched it, a wave of cold shot through my body, more intense than anything I'd felt before. The shadows recoiled and the whispers rose to a deafening chorus inside my head. I yanked my hand back, stumbling backward. The air from beneath the door thickened, curling around my ankles, rising in invisible tendrils. I realized then that the room wasn't simply cold, it was aware of me, exhaling to test me, probing, alive. The shadows near the walls twisted into humanoid shapes but fractured, incomplete, as if caught between dimensions. I wanted to scream. My voice caught. I felt a weight pressing against my chest, slow and heavy. I backed toward the stairs. The corridor's light seemed dimmer, the shadows darker, more confident. Something had noticed me, tracked my movements, anticipated my reactions. The air hummed low and deep. My flashlight flickered, casting the shadows into grotesque forms, stretching them along the walls. Faces appeared briefly in the black, staring, whispering, vanishing. I didn't understand how the light could reveal something that shouldn't exist, but it did. Curiosity fought my fear. I had to know. I circled the door cautiously, shining my light along its edges. There were scratches now, subtle, as if something had tried to push back against the wood from the inside. The exhalation became rhythmic, slow and steady, like a living being. I realized with a sinking sensation that the room was alive in a way I couldn't define. It breathed, pulsed, resisted, and it was aware of me. A faint draft brushed my face. I glanced at the shadows along the walls. One detached again, moving closer to the door than before, curling around the handle. I saw hints of shapes, hands, faces, shapes that weren't fully formed. The draft carried whispers now, snippets I couldn't understand fully, but one word repeated clearly: stay. My mind raced. I wanted to leave, to escape this impossible wing. Yet I felt tethered, drawn to the locked door. My fingers brushed the edge of the wood again. The pulse under the surface had grown stronger, syncing with my heartbeat. The exhalation rolled over my feet, wrapping around me, and I realized I was standing on the threshold of something old, patient, and aware. The shadows shifted again, more violently. One wrapped around my flashlight, dimming its beam, twisting it until the hall itself seemed to warp. I staggered, tripping over a loose floorboard. The whispers in my head became distinct syllables now, pressing, insistent. You cannot leave, not yet. They remember. I stumbled backward into the hallway, gasping, my flashlight shaking. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it all, that it was drafts, rust, and the weight of isolation. But then I saw it, a faint outline, almost transparent, pressing against the door from the inside. Something solid yet shifting, something alive. My stomach churned. My curiosity mingled with terror. The locked room was not empty. It had never been. I retreated slowly, every step measured, keeping my eyes on the door. The exhalation pulsed, synchronizing with the shadows that twisted along the walls. A slow, building anxiety grew, pressing into my chest. I realized I had been observed long before I arrived. Long before I noticed the hallway, the peeling wallpaper, the symbols. My presence here had been anticipated, calculated. The whispers softened, almost teasing now, threading through my thoughts. One voice pressed clearly, singular. Come closer if you dare. My flashlight trembled in my grip. I knew that if I tried, if I forced the door, the shadows would surge, the room would respond. But the need to understand, to see what lay behind that lock, clawed harder than my fear. I paused, breathing uneven, staring at the door. It exhaled once more, a deep, shuddering breath that wrapped around my ankles and rose to my knees. The shadows receded slightly, leaving the outline pressed against the wood visible again. My pulse raced. One question burned hotter than the rest. What waited beyond? I stepped back finally, mind screaming to run, body trembling. The hallway seemed to stretch infinitely behind me, but even as I moved, I knew the locked door had marked me. It had remembered me. It would wait. Shadows lingered in my periphery, whispers in my head pressing me with unrelenting patience. I realized that leaving this wing wouldn't end the anxiety. The room would follow me in memory, in pulse, in breath. I glanced once more at the door before turning toward the stairs. The exhalation ceased briefly, but I felt it in my chest, steady and alive. Something unseen watched from within, patient and knowing. And in that moment, I understood that some doors never truly close. Some rooms never forget. I turned away from the locked door, forcing myself to walk, though every step felt heavier than the last. The hallway stretched ahead, dim light flickering from cracks in the ceiling, casting shapes that twisted in ways my eyes couldn't quite follow. I tried to convince myself I was imagining the shadows, the whispers, the pulse that seemed to trail in my chest. But then I noticed them, footprints. They were faint, pressed into the thin layer of dust covering the floorboards leading toward the exit. I hadn't seen them when I came in. I stopped, heart hammering. They were small, human, yet somehow elongated, unnaturally precise. My mind tried to reason, maybe the wind, maybe debris, but nothing else had moved. The prints ended at my feet as if someone, or something, had followed me unseen. A soft exhale brushed the back of my neck, not quite air. A whisper, almost too quiet to catch, pressed against my mind. Some doors should never be opened. My skin crawled. I spun around, flashlight trembling, but the corridor was empty. The shadows clung to the walls, pooling in corners where light shouldn't reach. I wanted to tell myself it was just the old building settling. It was. I could feel it watching, patient, waiting. I moved faster, the wooden boards creaking underfoot, the faint footprints still ahead of me, echoing my steps. With every passing second, the whispers rose slightly in tone, layered voices now, indistinct yet insistent, curling in my thoughts. Do not turn. Leave now, it remembers. I clenched my fists, trying to push the fear down. Rational thought felt distant, replaced by a visceral knowledge. Something alive had lingered in that wing, and it hadn't released me yet. The air thickened as I approached the staircase leading out. A breeze came from somewhere unseen, carrying the faint, metallic scent I'd felt before, the one that had made my stomach knot near the locked door. It coiled around my ankles like smoke, slow, deliberate, almost playful. I tried to step through it, but the chill pressed against my skin, as if testing my resolve. I glanced down at the footprints again. They hadn't changed size, but now there were more of them, multiplying, overlapping, creating a network that stretched back down the corridor. I realized with sudden clarity that they didn't lead anywhere. They looped, doubled back as if marking territory. My chest tightened. The corridor wasn't just empty, it was alive, recording every movement I made. The staircase loomed ahead. Its edges were warped in the dim light, the steps groaning under my weight, echoing unnaturally. Every creak seemed exaggerated, resonating into the shadows that leaned closer, twisting into forms almost human, almost animal. I wanted to run, but my feet dragged. I was moving, yet part of me wanted to turn back, to understand what waited behind the doors I hadn't opened. A sudden shift in the air made me glance over my shoulder. The shadows had condensed along the walls, forming a figure, tall, distorted, blurred at the edges. It didn't move like a person. It was too smooth, too fluid. And for a moment I thought it had eyes, just one pair, reflecting the faint light. My mind screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. It tilted its head, just slightly, as if acknowledging me. I forced myself forward, gripping the railing. The staircase twisted downward, deeper than it should have, stretching impossibly in the dim light. Every step I took echoed in a rhythm that matched the pulse I'd felt at the locked door. Something was walking with me. Not beside me, not in front, but with me, and the footprints had followed. The whisper returned, louder this time, threading through the quiet. Do not linger. Leave now, or it will remember your name. My fingers tightened around the railing, knuckles white. The stairwell narrowed, shadows pressing from both sides, elongating, curving. I imagined them reaching for me, but when I blinked, they retreated just enough to let me continue. The footprints appeared again, scattered across the steps, impossibly small now, almost childlike but still deliberate. They pointed downward toward the lobby, but my heart told me the building had changed. The exit wasn't where it had been when I arrived. The shadows swirled near the walls, not hiding, not fleeing, observing, patient, calculating. Halfway down the staircase, the air shifted, carrying that metallic scent again, stronger. It pressed against my chest, twisting slightly like it knew the rhythm of my breathing. I gagged back, panic, forcing one slow step after another. The whispers were now fragmented phrases. Never leave empty-handed. It will follow, do not look back. They pressed into my mind, layering with the sound of my footsteps, until I couldn't tell where the building ended and my thoughts began. I reached the bottom of the staircase and saw the lobby through a gap in the hallway. It looked the same as before, dusty, abandoned, echoes of grandeur, but something was off. The light pooled strangely, bending against the edges of furniture, stretching long shadows across the floor. I noticed the footprints again. They led across the lobby, toward the exit, then vanished, cut off abruptly as if erased. My stomach knotted. They had only guided me here, but not beyond. A faint whisper curled behind me, "You can leave," but some doors never close. My head snapped around, empty air. Yet I felt the presence of the shadows clustered near the walls, stretching, twisting, observing. My chest heaved. I realized the wing wasn't empty. It had imprinted itself on me, marking my memory, and those marks wouldn't fade. I approached the exit, the wooden doors warped and swollen with age. My fingers brushed the handles, cool and rough. For a moment, relief washed over me. Fresh air beyond, freedom, escape. I pulled, but the doors resisted slightly, not locked, just hesitant. The shadows leaned closer, but I ignored them, summoning every ounce of strength to push through. I stepped outside. The air hit my face, sweet with morning chill, sharp and clean. My chest heaved with relief. I glanced back at the lobby through the glass. The shadows were gone, or so I thought, but faint traces of movement lingered, flickers near the edges of vision, shapes that shouldn't exist. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was imagination. Then I noticed something on the ground near the entrance. A small scrap of paper, curled at the edges, dusted with the same gray that coated the hallway. I picked it up with trembling hands. Scribbled across it, almost impatiently, were words I didn't recognize at first. Some doors should never be opened. The writing pressed into my mind like a weight, familiar yet alien. I shoved it into my pocket, the words echoing even as I walked away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The hallway, the locked door, the shadows, they all lingered in memory, stretching beyond the limits of the building. Even as the morning light touched my skin, I could feel the pulse, slow and patient, as if something followed. Not in body, but in thought. I realized then that leaving didn't mean escaping. It meant carrying the building with me, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. I walked faster, streets empty, the city quiet. My mind circled the events again and again. The breathing room, the shadows, the whispers, the footprints. Everything had seemed alive, aware, but why me? Why had I been marked? A shiver ran down my spine. Some presence had observed me. It had anticipated my choices, nudged me forward, measured my fear. And now it had gone silent, but I knew it hadn't left. Hours later, I tried to forget. I told myself the building, the wing, the locked room were nothing more than old architecture, drafts, and dust. But at night, in the silence of my own home, I'd hear faint whispers echoing. Some doors should never be opened. And sometimes I'd see shadows twist at the edges of my vision, faint traces of forms I couldn't recognize. They weren't confined to that building anymore. I realized that leaving didn't grant freedom. It only revealed a truth. Some places don't just exist, they remember. And they follow. I wondered then, as I lay awake, tracing the ceiling in my small apartment, whether the locked doors waited still, patient, breathing, keeping count of who had crossed the threshold, who had dared. I will never return. I cannot. But the footprints, the whispers, and the pulse of that locked room will stay with me. And I know deep down that it waits for the next curiosity, the next hand that touches a door it guards. And when it comes again, I won't be ready. The train hissed and sighed as it slowed, groaning against the rails like it didn't want to stop. I pressed my forehead to the cold window, watching the dark countryside blur past, knowing I was nearing the end of the line. The announcements had long since stopped. Only the low rumble of wheels remained. Somewhere ahead, faint lights shimmered, scattered, hesitant, like they weren't meant to be there. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the doors slid open with a lazy groan. I stepped out into the platform and the air struck me first, cold but dry, unnervingly still. No wind, no movement, only the subtle scent of iron and damp wood. My bag felt heavier than it should, as if it absorbed some of the station's weight. I glanced around. Empty benches, flickering lights that should have been comforting but instead made the shadows deeper, longer. And then, beyond the platform, the hotel. It stood alone, isolated, more structure than building, and it seemed to exhale calm. Its windows reflected nothing, like mirrors of black glass. The paint was peeling, edges chipped, but the shape remained elegant, imposing. The front doors waited silently, as if the building itself expected me, and maybe it did. I walked toward it, boots crunching on the gravel. Each step sounded loud, echoing off walls that should have been distant but felt close. My stomach twisted. Something about the calm was wrong, but I couldn't name it. It wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation, subtle and patient, like the world held its breath. I reached the door, pushed, and it opened without resistance, though the air inside felt dense, heavier than outside. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. A thick carpet dulled my steps, and the faint scent of old wood and polish clung to the corners. Chandeliers hung like frozen lanterns, crystals catching the minimal light and scattering faint reflections across the walls. A clock ticked somewhere, its sound muffled but persistent, and I realized with unease that the echo of my footsteps mingled with it, creating a rhythm that didn't belong. Behind the desk stood a figure, a concierge. Not tall, not short, perfectly still, hands folded. The uniform was impeccable, crisp lines, polished buttons, but it wasn't the uniform that unsettled me. It was the smile, not broad, not kind, calculated, almost knowing. "Welcome," he said, voice soft, smooth, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. "I've been expecting you." I stopped, a chill running down my spine. Expecting me. The station, the hotel, the darkness outside, they had been empty until now. How could anyone know I would arrive? I forced a smile, cleared my throat. "Just checking in. Long day of travel." He nodded, tilting his head slightly. "Yes, long days have a way of finding certain people. Rooms are ready, of course." His eyes didn't meet mine directly. They lingered on me in ways I didn't want. I stepped closer, reaching for my wallet, trying to mask the shiver that traveled down my spine. "Do you often get late arrivals?" I asked, testing, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled again. "Some guests never arrive on time. Others never leave as expected." His words, casual, lingered in the air longer than necessary, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. I ignored it, handing over my identification. The concierge examined it slowly, almost reverently, then handed it back. "Your key," he said, sliding a brass card across the desk. The weight of it seemed heavier than brass should be. Cold, almost burning to the touch. I stared at it for a moment, sensing that it wasn't just a key, it was a promise, a warning. The hallway to my room stretched from the lobby, light dim, carpet patterned in dark reds and browns, edges frayed. Every step forward made the air thicker. The hotel smelled old but alive, like it had breathed through decades of whispered conversations, secrets, and regrets. I passed portraits on the walls, faces that didn't move, yet seemed aware, watching. Their eyes glimmered faintly in the low light, shadows shifting across their expressions. I forced my eyes away, focusing on the room number at the end. I reached the door and slid the key card through the reader. A soft click, a hiss of unlocking. I turned the handle, pushed, and the door swung open. The room was as I expected, bed, dresser, small desk. But the air was different here, heavier, expectant. I stepped inside and the door clicked behind me. Alone, I thought. Alone, yes, but not unobserved. Sitting on the desk was a small envelope, cream-colored, handwritten. I hadn't seen it when I opened the door. My name was on it in a hand I didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar. Trembling, I opened it. Inside was a single line, "You've arrived." That's the first step. No signature, no explanation. My pulse quickened. The words were neutral, but they pressed against me with weight, as if the paper carried intention. I turned toward the window. The view outside was dark, the hotel grounds stretching into shadows that merged with the night. The platform was gone, or maybe it had never been there. My mind spun for a moment. The station, the train, the lonely journey, they felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. The hotel's calm had swallowed them, and now I wondered what else it might devour. A soft knock echoed at the door. My heart jumped. I hadn't called anyone. My fingers hovered over the handle. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. I swallowed, forcing a steadying breath, and opened the door. Nobody. Just the hallway stretching empty, shadows pooling near the walls. I stepped out, peering down the corridor. The faint click of the door behind me made me flinch. I walked toward the elevator at the end, trying to convince myself I was imagining everything. The carpet muffled my steps, yet I felt the weight of the building pressing closer, like it had lungs and was breathing with me. I pressed the button. The elevator doors opened, dark inside. No reflection of the lobby, no lights, just a gaping void. Hesitant, I stepped in. The doors closed smoothly. Lights flickered on, revealing a mirror across the back wall. I glanced at myself, then froze. For a heartbeat, the concierge's reflection stood beside me, smiling, calm, knowing, though I was alone. My chest tightened. I whipped around, empty. My eyes darted back to the mirror. Nothing. But the image lingered, subtle in my mind, like a memory carved into the air. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed, rising slowly. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Reflection tricks, shadows, tired mind. Yet the unease wouldn't leave. The air inside the car felt colder, thick with a presence I could not see. The thought struck me. I had stepped inside willingly, but perhaps willingly wasn't the same as choosing. The elevator stopped. Doors slid open to another hallway, narrow, stretching farther than I remembered from the map in the lobby. Light flickered, revealing patterned wallpaper curling at the edges, faint stains along the seams. I walked cautiously, each step echoing, shadows stretching across the walls like they were leaning in. The air smelled faintly metallic, just enough to make my stomach twist. My room was at the end. I reached the door, key in hand. I hesitated. Something felt off. The envelope, the reflection, the whispers in the hall, I wasn't imagining them. The hotel had noticed me, had prepared for me. My hand hovered over the handle, frozen. A soft murmur drifted along the carpet. Not words exactly, but intent, pressing on my mind. I pulled the door open anyway. Inside, the room was empty. Nothing on the desk but the bed neatly made. I exhaled, tension easing slightly. Relief was brief. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. It had shifted, moved with me, waiting. I realized then that the hotel wasn't just a building. It was patient. It remembered. And it had plans for anyone who arrived, anyone who lingered too long. I set my bag down, trying to shake the unease. The window, slightly ajar, carried a chill from the grounds outside. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness, and for a moment thought I saw movement among the trees. Another figure or a trick of the shadows. I couldn't tell. The calm outside was no relief, only another layer of anticipation. I sat on the edge of the bed, finally, and let the envelope's words sink in. You've arrived. That's the first step. What came next? The thought twisted, knotted in my chest, and I knew that even as sleep threatened, I would not be alone. The hotel waited, patient and unseen, and in the quiet, I could hear its intentions curling around the corners of my mind, subtle, persistent. Somewhere in the lobby, the concierge smiled, or at least I imagined he did, and I realized then that I would see that smile again, perhaps in reflections, perhaps in dreams, perhaps waiting for the next step. I followed the narrow corridor from the lobby, the carpeted floor swallowing my footsteps. Every echo seemed to trail behind me, delayed, as if the building itself was listening, judging. The walls were lined with portraits, faces blurred by age, eyes catching the faint light in ways that made them seem alive. I told myself it was the dimness, the flickering of the sconces, but my chest tightened anyway. The corridor opened into the lounge. Dim light spilled from amber lamps, each casting long, wavering shadows across the worn furniture. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and wood polish, heavy and stale at the same time. A fire flickered in a marble hearth, though the logs looked untouched for years. I realized I could hear whispers, soft, fractured, half-formed, drifting just beyond comprehension. A few guests sat scattered on armchairs, their voices low, hesitant. One man stared at his hands as he muttered something I couldn't catch. A woman traced the rim of her glass with a fingertip, murmuring numbers or letters. I wasn't sure. Their eyes were hollow in a way that made me uncomfortable, like they were waiting for something or someone. I stepped lightly toward the center of the room. A staff member appeared at my elbow, silently polite, almost imperceptible, like they had materialized from the shadows. "Would you like a seat?" they asked. The tone was calm, measured. Too measured. I hesitated. Something about their insistence made me uneasy. It wasn't hospitality, it was a command masked as courtesy. I nodded, too aware of the quiet that followed me to the nearest chair. As I sat, the murmurs continued, overlapping and dissolving into the air, leaving fragments of sentences that pressed against my mind. I caught one phrase, "Before he arrives," and another, "Don't let them see." I blinked, glanced around. The guests were still, but their attention seemed elsewhere, distant, as if they were speaking to something unseen. The staff lingered nearby, arms folded, eyes polite but unwavering. They offered water, blankets, soft nods of acknowledgement. "It's best not to disturb the others," one said. "Quiet keeps them comfortable." Comfortable. I swallowed. The word felt hollow. What kind of comfort waited in a room filled with murmurs and half-frozen faces? I studied the guests. Each seemed trapped in a rhythm, a loop I could not penetrate. A man rocked slightly, whispering names I didn't recognize. The woman traced the edge of the rug repeatedly, fingers pale against the dark fabric. Their eyes, though, were the worst part, blank yet aware, alert yet distant. They watched and didn't watch at the same time. I felt a prickle of fear I couldn't name. A clock on the far wall ticked unevenly, its hands jittering as if uncertain of time itself. I glanced at it again, trying to anchor myself. The room didn't feel the same as it had a moment ago. Shadows pooled differently across the floor, and the whispers seemed closer, circling, patient. Something was moving behind the darkened corners, subtle, deliberate. I caught a faint reflection in the polished surface of a table. A figure shifted behind me, but when I spun around, nothing. Empty space, vacant chairs, the fire still flickering, the logs unmoved. My pulse raced. I felt exposed, too aware, as if the room was measuring my reaction, gauging whether I belonged, or whether I could. The staff member approached again, stepping lightly, voice softer this time. "Some doors are not meant to be open tonight." I froze. I'm just waiting," I stammered. Their eyes were calm, polite, yet sharp. "Even waiting requires care," they said, retreating as silently as they had arrived. My throat tightened. Care. The word twisted in my chest like a warning I couldn't fully understand. I returned my gaze to the guests. The murmurs were shaping into sentences now, fragments of thought, as if they were trying to speak truths they couldn't fully grasp. "He comes, he waits, doors will close." The voices overlapped, creating a rhythm I couldn't escape. My head spun. Was I imagining it, or was the room guiding them, pushing their words into the air for me to hear? The fire flickered and a shadow detached itself from the wall, slow, deliberate, like it had weight. It moved independently of the lamp's glow, stretching across the carpet, dissolving, reforming. I swallowed hard. The guests didn't react. Their murmurs continued, oblivious or pretending to be. My stomach churned. The lounge was alive, aware, patient. I glanced toward the entrance, thinking of leaving, but the staff member was already there, hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Their smile was polite, careful, and I realized it didn't reach the eyes. "It is better to stay," they said simply. "You are expected." Expected. The word hit differently this time. I was not just a visitor. I was part of the pattern. I sank deeper into the chair, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers rose and fell, fragments now forming patterns I almost recognized. Names, dates, warnings. Something in the room wanted me to remember, to understand, but the logic twisted before it reached me. I felt my grip on time slip, minutes stretching, compressing, until I could no longer tell whether I had been seated for moments or hours. A faint scratching sound began behind the fireplace. I looked closer. Nothing visible. Just the logs, the hearth, the pale glow of fire, but the sound persisted. Soft, deliberate, like nails tracing wood. The guests murmured in response, low and approving, acknowledging it without turning. Approval for what? I clenched my fists. The room demanded attention, demanded compliance, yet I didn't know to what. The staff member approached once more, gliding silently. "The lounge is for waiting," they said, "not for questioning." Their voice was calm, neutral, yet it carried weight. I realized my thoughts weren't my own. The room was pressing on them, nudging, shaping. I forced my mind to focus, to remember why I had arrived here in the first place. A train, a station, a lonely late-night journey. Was it all real, or had the hotel's calm already begun to claim me? I noticed small details now, ones I hadn't before. The rug edges frayed identically to the carpet in the corridor. Shadows pooled in corners that should have been illuminated. The portraits on the walls had changed, subtly, imperceptibly. Eyes that had once looked away now followed me. The awareness in the room was deliberate, omnipresent, patient. The fire flickered again. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement in the flames, an outline human staring directly at me. The whispers intensified, rising in a rhythm I could feel in my chest, resonating, vibrating. My fingers trembled. I wanted to leave, yet the staff, the lounge, the shadows themselves seemed to hold me in place, tethered by invisible threads. Then a shift. The murmurs softened. The guests slumped slightly, as if waiting for me to make a choice. I realized the lounge was not just a room. It was a test, a mirror of patience, of fear, of understanding. Every whispered fragment, every shadow, every polite insistence from the staff was a measure of me. I leaned back in the chair, attempting a calm I didn't feel. The envelope in my bag from the lobby pressed against my side, heavy and insistent. I pulled it out, glanced at it again. "You've arrived. That's the first step." What was the next? The lounge seemed to pulse around me, expecting, patient. I understood then that waiting was not passive. Waiting was the beginning, a prelude to what the hotel had planned, and the room would not forget me, would not let me leave unexamined. Minutes or hours passed. The fire flickered once more, casting a shadow that stretched unnaturally, longer than the room should allow. The guests murmured, each phrase a thread connecting them to me, to the building itself. I realized with a cold certainty that this was not a space for rest. It was a place to observe, to measure, to prepare. I stood finally, legs stiff. The staff member bowed slightly, allowing me passage. Their eyes, polite and calm, seemed to linger on me longer than necessary. I understood without words. The lounge remembered, and it would remind me again. The path ahead was not linear. It twisted, deliberate, patient. I took one last glance at the guests. Hollow eyes, whispers fading into silence, and the shadows clinging to corners like creatures that would not release me. I knew then that leaving the lounge was not an escape. It was an acknowledgement of something larger, something waiting beyond the doors, beyond the calm, beyond the measured smile of the staff. The corridor stretched before me, dim and patterned in reds and browns, familiar yet alien. Each step forward was deliberate. I was leaving the parlor, yes, but its awareness followed, lingering, patient, waiting for the next heartbeat, the next thought, the next whisper. And in the quiet, I realized something else. The lounge had taught me the first lesson. Silence is not absence. Calm is not peace. Waiting is never neutral. The first light of morning came in slow, pale slashes through the hotel windows, and I realized I hadn't noticed the hours pass. The lounge was empty now, the fire dead, the guests gone, leaving only the lingering echo of murmurs. My bag felt heavier, as if the hotel had pressed something unseen into it while I slept, or thought I slept. I stood slowly, testing the floorboards. They creaked the same way, yet the sound didn't settle into memory. It floated, hesitant, like a half-forgotten warning. I moved toward the exit. The front doors loomed wider than I remembered, polished brass handles catching the weak sunlight. Outside, the courtyard looked familiar but wrong. The hedges were taller, denser, and the cobblestones beneath my boots seemed to have shifted, as though someone had redrawn the lines while I wasn't looking. The air was cold for morning, dry and thin, carrying a scent I couldn't place, something earthy, old, and faintly metallic. I tried to follow the path to the railway station, the plan I had rehearsed in my head, but the tracks weren't where they should be. They curved in impossible ways, ending abruptly in fields of fog that rolled like water. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the tracks seemed to move subtly, shifting like liquid iron beneath my gaze. My stomach tightened. I had taken this route yesterday, or had I? The memory of leaving the hotel was clear in parts, fragmented in others, like a dream I couldn't fully trust. A soft wind stirred the trees. I heard a distant whistle, the kind trains make, but no engine appeared. I wanted to run toward it, find grounding in something recognizable, yet my feet felt weighted, reluctant. The landscape itself seemed to resist me, folding, reshaping, maintaining the illusion of normality while hiding the truth. Every familiar object, fence posts, a lamp, the curve of the path was slightly off, wrong enough to be noticed, yet too subtle to describe. I paused at a bend in the tracks, staring at the horizon. Mist clung to the fields, curling around stones and shrubs, swallowing their edges. It felt alive, moving with intention, like it had been waiting for me. I realized my shadow didn't line up with the sunlight. It stretched longer than it should, thin, unnaturally dark, and it didn't quite mimic my movements. My reflection in a puddle nearby was also wrong. The face staring back was mine, but with eyes too wide, too sharp, watching me as if it knew something I didn't. I took a hesitant step forward. A branch snapped behind me, soft but precise. I whirled. Nothing. The air held no one. No birds, no animals, just the faint whistle again, as if someone were repeating it at irregular intervals, taunting me with something I could not see. My pulse sped. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it, but the cold prickling on my skin said otherwise. The hotel hadn't finished with me. It was still here, embedded in the fog, folded into the air and shadows. I glanced back at the hotel. The sun had risen, but the building's outline seemed to quiver, edges softening then hardening as if it were breathing. A door opened, a single small door at the side I had never noticed, and a figure appeared in the frame. I squinted. It looked like the concierge, smiling, impeccable in posture and suit, hands folded neatly in front. But as I blinked, the figure vanished. The shadows on the building's walls stretched, bending toward me, and a faint whisper grazed my ear. Some paths are not meant to be followed. I turned back to the tracks. They twisted again, leading into a hollow that shouldn't exist. My instincts screamed to follow the road I knew, the route I had arrived on, but the map in my mind felt useless. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a puzzle I hadn't yet learned to solve. I tried to remember the layout, the familiar curves of rails, the small bridge over the creek, but every memory faltered, uncertain. What was memory, and what was the hotel's construction of it? The fog thickened. I could see the outline of the station across the field, but it seemed smaller, further away than it should have been. My breath fogged before me. I realized I wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed behind me, light, deliberate, keeping pace. I spun. Empty air, only the tracks leading me into the mist. I took a step faster. The echoes followed. I ran. The wind tore at my clothes, carrying whispers I couldn't catch. Return before it ends, do. The words teased my mind, unformed and urgent. I stumbled onto a small rise. From here the landscape spread, a patchwork of normality and impossibility. Trees grew at angles that defied gravity. A farmhouse crouched in the distance, its windows dark and yawning, but shadows moved behind the glass that should not have been there. I froze. My mind caught glimpses, faces in the fog, half seen, staring, watching, waiting. I could almost hear their breathing, shallow and anxious, yet heavy with expectation. I forced myself to keep moving. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted my passage. The whistle came again, closer now, teasing, echoing, yet no train arrived. I realized I couldn't tell north from south. Every landmark felt familiar, yet none lined up with the last time I saw them. My anxiety grew, pressing against my ribs. The hotel had followed me here, beyond the walls, beyond the lounge, beyond waiting. Its presence was a weight, a shadow draped over everything. I came to a point where the tracks ended abruptly in a shallow ravine. The iron rails were twisted, broken, melting into the fog like smoke. My reflection shimmered again in a puddle nearby. The eyes staring back were not mine entirely. There was something extra there. Anticipation, patience, the faintest hint of amusement. I touched the water and my fingers sank, ripples distorting the face, stretching it, dragging it into the mist. A voice, soft, deliberate, came from behind, closer than it should have been. You are still here. I spun. Empty. Nothing. The fog swallowed everything. My heart thudded in my ears. I realized that leaving the hotel hadn't meant escape. It had only been the first stage, a transition. The landscape itself had become an extension of the hotel, bending and waiting, teaching me the rules I did not yet know. I glanced toward the horizon. The station was visible again, but it had shifted slightly, the roof lower, the platform crooked. I noticed faint footprints in the soft earth, mine or someone else's, I couldn't tell. They appeared fresh, leading alongside the tracks, always keeping pace with me, vanishing in the fog just before I could reach them. Each step I took felt like walking deeper into a puzzle without a solution. I forced myself to breathe, trying to ground reality. The sun was higher now, yet the shadows it cast were wrong, elongated black edges spilling into places light should touch. The fog danced around the horizon, curling, folding over itself, like a slow, deliberate tide. I understood then that the morning had not broken, not fully. Time itself seemed uncertain here. The world was waiting, and I was merely part of its experiment. A bird called somewhere, sharp, brief, and absurdly loud. I flinched. My pulse quickened. Then the sound repeated, closer, more deliberate. My mind searched for meaning, for logic, but the world refused to provide it. The tracks curved again, leading into a hollow I had already seen, or perhaps had not. The anticipation was unbearable. I wanted the familiar, the mundane, but it was gone. The hotel had folded it, twisted it, scattered it like ash in the wind. I walked on, step by step, heart tight in my chest, shadows clinging to me. The whispers had returned, now more coherent, a chorus of warnings, advice, reminders I didn't remember needing. Not yet remember the lounge doors left open, waiting is not idle. Each phrase cut through the fog, pressing against my memory, against my perception. I realized the hotel's influence had not ended at the threshold. It had followed me, embedded itself in the earth, in the mist, in the very air. I stopped at the end of the hollow. The tracks vanished entirely here, twisted into nothingness. Beyond lay only fog and muted sunlight, the world uncertain. The footprints continued alongside me, soft, intentional, leading nowhere. I understood then that leaving the hotel had never been about the building. It had been about leaving what I thought I knew, what was familiar, what was safe. The landscape had become a test, a reflection of every decision I had made, every step forward. I took a final breath, the fog curling around me like fingers. I felt the weight of the hotel's presence, patient, waiting for my next move. I understood that the journey was only beginning. The morning had arrived, yes, but not freedom. Only clarity that the world around me had shifted subtly, irrevocably, and that the hotel's shadows were not confined to its walls. And somewhere in the fog, I heard the softest whisper, patient. Deliberate, do not return, not yet.